Ladies and gentlemen, this past January, President Obama issued Executive Order 1356-3 to improve regulations and the regulatory review process, noting that our regulatory system, quote, must protect public health, welfare, safety, and our environment while promoting economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation, end quote. With job creation and the nation's economic recovery the focal point, the subcommittee has sought to get a clear understanding of agency regulatory action under this administration. Today, in our 7th hearing in this effort, we will examine the EPA's regulatory planning, analysis, and major actions taken. While we agree with the principles outlined in the executive order, we are disappointed that EPA does not seem to have followed those principles. Time and time again, over the last 3 years, we have seen the EPA issued oppressive new regulations that have dramatically raised the cost of doing business in the United States and indeed have driven numerous American companies out of business altogether. The EPA is unquestionably an important public health regulatory agency which has contributed to the tremendous improvements in clean air, safe drinking water, and environmental quality over the past 40 years. It is also an agency that wields tremendous influence over the essential ingredients of economic recovery, the cost of manufacturing, construction, and power production, the reliability of energy, the certainty of future rules and standards in the decisions that drive the nation's commerce. Since the beginning of this administration, EPA has issued or proposed a number of large, complex, and expensive rules. The pace of these rulemaking is such that it is not always clear EPA has fully considered or fully informed the public about the potential negative consequences of its actions on the United States economy, job creation, and our ability to compete with countries around the world. Now consider the decisions in the first weeks of the administration to pursue an endangerment findings for greenhouse gases. This formed the regulatory predicate for setting fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, an EPA estimated cost of about $60 billion. The President announced the prospect of this new regulation at a Rose Garden ceremony. But there was no public discussion about the fact that the new regulation also would have automatically triggered new permitting requirements required by the Clean Air Act for all stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. These permitting requirements meant that 82,000 stationary sources annually would need to obtain pre-construction permits. Another 6.1 million sources would need to obtain operating permits. EPA estimated that absent a rulemaking to exempt the majority of these sources, the permitting cost alone would be $193 billion over just a 3-year period. The cost of ceasing operations or not initiating new projects was never taken into account. To avoid this absurd and self-imposed economic calamity, EPA issued, quote, tailoring rules to exempt most but not all sources, but left open the possibility of sweeping more entities into the new permitting regime at a later date. This affects the entire U.S. economy as the future of greenhouse gas permitting exists under a cloud of uncertainty. Now, in another case, in January 2010, EPA chose to reconsider ground-level ozone standards set just recently in 2008. Although the proposed standards would potentially sweep vast areas of the nation into non-compliance and cost upwards of $90 billion per year, the agency sought to rush and issue final standards in just 8 months. The agency missed that deadline, but was still promising to issue final standards until the President himself, recognizing that issuing such a rule would cause him severe electoral problems in the next election, recently requested that the administrator refrain from issuing the ozone rule at this time. The President is on board, however, with issuing onerous new regulations in 2013 after the election. Just yesterday, this committee reported legislation to provide adequate time for EPA to develop standards for hazardous air pollutants for boilers and cement plants, after it became apparent that EPA's complex and admittedly rushed rulemaking results in requirements simply unachievable in the real world. Under the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and various other statutes, EPA appears to be rushing forward with rulemakings that just don't make sense for those who know what it takes to implement them and those concerned with ensuring we simply have a vital economy. It does not appear that the President's stated priorities for thoughtful, transparent, and sound rulemaking have taken hold at the EPA. I'm particularly interested in learning about EPA's future regulatory plans and how the cumulative impact of its rules informed its planning. Does EPA consult adequately with other agencies? Does EPA operate openly with affected stakeholders, states, and the public? These are important questions. I look forward to our discussion with the Honorable Lisa Jackson. With that, I recognize the distinguished ranking member, Diana DeGette from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. I think that oversight directed towards ensuring efficient and effective federal regulation is an important endeavor, and I like to work with the majority to have efforts to root out unnecessary and wasteful regulations. As a longtime member of this distinguished subcommittee, I believe the purpose of this committee is to investigate what can be done, not to forward a political agenda. And so I know we're going to have a heated discussion today, but I think we should keep it focused on exactly what regulations we're talking about, what the purpose is, and if in fact they're necessary. To that end, I'm delighted to welcome our witness today, EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson. Administrator Jackson oversees implementation of some of the most important legislation ever passed by Congress, and it's my view that she's one of the most gutsy and effective members of the administration, so I'm glad to have her. The main topic of the conversation today will be jobs. I know that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will assert that environmental rules and regulations are stifling jobs and harming economic growth, but this is simply not the case. We need to keep in mind the purpose of the Clean Air Act, to protect the health of Americans. Now, in 2010 alone, the Clean Air Act prevented 160,000 premature deaths, millions of respiratory illnesses, 3 million lost school days, and 13 million lost work days. By 2020, the Clean Air Act's total benefit to the economy will reach $2 trillion, outweighing costs more than 30 to 1. The Clean Air Act and other environmental laws do something else. They create millions of jobs, and they could create millions more jobs if it weren't for the inaction of this Congress to pass climate change legislation. Compliance with the Clean Air Act generates investment in design, manufacture, installation, and operation of equipment to reduce pollution. The environmental technology and services sector has grown steadily since the Act's adoption, generating $300 billion in revenue and supporting nearly 1.7 million jobs in 2008 alone. Clean Air Act rules recently announced by the EPA will only add to this remarkable record. For example, investments spurred by the utility, toxics, and cross-state air pollution rules will generate 1.5 million new jobs by 2015. These will be high-paying, skilled professional jobs that cannot be outsourced. Mr. Chairman, one of the biggest steps this committee could take to boost the economy would be to pass long overdue legislation to combat climate change and usher in an era of clean energy. Now, you don't need to be a Democrat to believe this. You just need to live in the science-based world. 2 years ago, when this committee passed landmark climate legislation, we heard from business leaders that there were billions of dollars sitting on the sidelines, just waiting for clear rules of the road to be drawn up for the nation's energy future. I just met with the Colorado Rural Electric folks yesterday who told me the same thing. And these business leaders continue to ask Congress to act. Just last week, for example, the American Energy Innovation Council, led by people like Bill Gates, venture capitalist John Doerr, and General Electric CEO Jeff Immelt, implored the federal government to invest in clean energy technologies. I want to read to you from these leaders' recent report, Catalyzing Ingenuity. Quote, "Innovation is the core of America's economic strength and future prosperity. New ideas are the key to fostering sustained economic growth, creating jobs in new industries, and continuing America's global leadership. Of all the sectors in the economy where innovation has a critical role to play, the energy sector stands out. Ready access to reliable, affordable forms of energy is not only vital for the functioning of the larger economy, it's also vital to people's everyday lives. It also significantly impacts the country's national security, environmental well-being, and economic competitiveness." End quote. Mr. Chairman, here's what these business leaders conclude. Quote, "Unfortunately, the country has yet to embark on a clean energy innovation program commensurate with the scale of the national priorities that are at stake." Mr. Chairman, this committee should listen to these titans of the economy. We should be passing legislation to unleash American innovation and create American jobs in the new energy economy. Instead, unfortunately, this Congress is sitting on the sidelines pretending that scientific and economic realities do not exist. In March, every single Republican member of this committee voted against the overwhelming scientific consensus to deny the very existence of global climate change. Many Republican members are using this cylinder debacle as an excuse to all-out cut energy funding. This denial of reality is bad for the economy and bad for the environment. So I'm glad to have this discussion about the rules and regulatory reform efforts, and I hope that we can come together in a science-based discussion to talk about new energy and the new economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlelady, and recognize the chairman of the full Energy and Commerce Committee, the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout the year, this committee has focused its oversight and legislation on identifying and mitigating the job-destroying impacts of burdensome regulations. And through its regulatory reform hearing series, this subcommittee's examination of the President's regulatory principles has helped to sharpen our focus on important gaps between the administration's rhetoric and reality. The rhetoric, which I agree with, is that we should implement reasonable and achievable regs to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the American people. And we recognize that well-being must include ensuring economic growth and healthy job creation. The President has talked about the importance of cost-benefit analysis to ensure that regulations do more good than harm. The reality, unfortunately, is a regulatory onslaught from EPA that is destroying jobs and stifling economic growth with financial burdens and uncertainty. And in some cases, the cost-benefit analysis is completely absent. In other cases, the devastating economic consequences of rules are flat out ignored. Over the years, I have seen EPA conduct rulemakings on important Clean Air Act provisions, but I've never seen so many major rules from EPA at a pace and complexity as has occurred during this administration. There have been complex rules with profound impacts on energy production and manufacturing, essential contributors to economic growth in this country. In some cases, such as the boiler and cement rules, we have regs that are technically unachievable because EPA appears to be doing too much too fast. In other cases, the agency lays out rapid and changing deadlines and makes alterations to the rulemakings that raise questions about regulatory judgment and decision-making in the first place. We want the EPA and the administration to comply with its own principles as outlined in the President's executive order on regulation. Today, we're going to hear directly from Administrator Jackson to learn just what steps she plans to take to ensure that these actions will match the administration's regulatory rhetoric. And I yield to my friend, the Chairman Emeritus of the committee, Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome again, Madam Administrator. It's good to have you with us. There are many things that are ailing our country right now, Madam Administrator, and it seems that your agency appears to be at ground zero of a fair number of them. Since President Obama took office and you became the administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA has rushed to issue rules on greenhouse gases, which the Congress rejected in the last Congress, ozone, which our President just rejected several weeks ago, coal ash, boiler ash, and our boiler MACT and cement industries, which those industries are strenuously objecting to. In my home state of Texas, last year the EPA revoked the flexible air quality permit rules that had been in place for almost 20 years, starting with President Clinton. And just recently, the EPA announced a cross-state air pollution rule where Texas, which wasn't even included in the rule 6 months ago, is expected to assume somewhere between 25 and 40% of the reductions. This is somewhat puzzling since our monitors indicate that we're in compliance, and it's an EPA model that seems to indicate that in certain states there might be a problem. The cost of all these rules is in the billions of dollars annually, resulting in thousands of jobs lost. Just last week in my state, in my congressional district, a company that is subject to the cross-state air pollution announced the closure of 2 mines and reduction or closure of 2 power plants that in my district alone is probably going to cost in the order of magnitude 1,000 jobs. We have a president who says that we need to create jobs, not destroy jobs. We have a president who says we need a regulatory environment that has a cost-benefit analysis. And yet your agency, the EPA, seems to ignore these admonitions. It's as if there is some evil genie at the EPA that is bound and determined to put every regulation possible on the books as soon as possible, regardless of the economic consequences. I hope today, Madam Chairwoman, Madam Administrator, that we can get into some of these specific rules. We have a number of very specific questions that we want to ask, and as always, we look forward to having you answer them and tell us where your agency is. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There are 3 seconds. Dr. Burgess, you want to take 5, 10 seconds?
Well, yeah, let me just submit my entire opening statement to the record, but I do want to remind the administrator, as we have had to remind every cabinet secretary, every head of the federal agencies, that although you work for the executive branch, Congress is a co-equal branch of government. When we ask for stuff, you need to produce it. We have been stonewalled in this committee over and over again, and those days have to stop because the American people are asking serious questions. They want answers, and it's up to this committee to get those answers for them. Now,
and I thank the gentleman. And now we recognize the...
Mr. Chairman, before you recognize me, I'd like to ask the gentleman from Texas to provide for us examples of where you think EPA is stonewalled, not now, but for the record, because this statement has been made, and I'd like to see verification for it.
Particularly been on the Title 42 regulations, and I've asked these questions.
I'd like to see documentary information.
The gentleman from California is recognized for his opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is our 7th hearing on regulatory reform, and we'll be told by our colleagues across the aisle, EPA needs to do a better job. We'll hear them say they need to better analyze regulations before finalizing. They need to listen to concerns about their proposals before acting. But this hearing isn't really about regulatory reform. It's just a continuation of a long series of attacks on our environment and public health. This is the most anti-environmental House of Representatives in history. So far, this Congress, the House of Representatives, has voted again and again to block action to address climate change, to halt efforts to reduce air and water pollution, to undermine protections for public lands and coastal areas, and to weaken the protection of the environment in other ways. Mr. Chairman, my staff prepared a database last month on every anti-environmental vote taken in this Congress. The tally was 125. 125 votes to weaken the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, to make our drinking water less safe, to weaken environmental standards in dozens of different ways. This is an appalling and dangerous environmental record. And it should come as no surprise that this record of anti-environmental votes shows little concern for crafting well-analyzed policy that takes the views of all stakeholders into account. Today, the House will begin consideration of the Train Act, a bill whose passage will block actions to clean up smog, soot, and toxic air pollution from the nation's power plants. When this bill is considered, we'll vote on amendments offered by Chairman Whitfield and Representative Latta. The Whitfield amendment will eviscerate the law's ability to require power plants to install modern pollution controls. The Latta amendment will reverse 40 years of clean air policy, allowing our national goals for clean air to be determined by corporate profits, not public health. They will not agree that we need to have a hearing on the Latta amendment before reversing 40 years of success with the Clean Air Act. The Republicans will not clarify the bill on industrial boilers to prevent years and years of litigation and delay. We should hear from states, industry, public health groups, clean air advocates, and other stakeholders before voting on these radical clean air amendments. These amendments are being considered through an egregiously flawed process, a stark change from the way this committee has traditionally handled important clean air legislation. We should at least understand what they do before voting on them. And we're sitting here criticizing EPA for all the work they put into their regulations before they issue them, and yet we're going to pass laws, at least pass it through the House, without a single moment of hearing, just because some representatives want to, and maybe the Republican Party wants to respond to big business and forget about the safety and the well-being and the health of the American people. Well, today's hearing will provide an opportunity to hear from the administrator of the EPA, and I'm pleased to welcome Lisa Jackson. This is not the first time. I don't know how many times she's had to appear before this committee. I don't think she has time to do all the dreadful things the Republicans are accusing her of doing, because she's spending most of her time here to listen to complaints from the Republicans about regulations, some of which they haven't even proposed, and the Republicans want to repeal it. I will ask the administrator about the Whitfield and the Latta amendments and how dangerous they are to the American people. That will serve as some opportunity to examine these issues, and it will give us an opportunity to hear from the EPA administrator of the impacts of the entire Republican anti-environment agenda. Mr. Chairman, I want to, you want some time? I have a minute left if any of my Democratic colleagues, Ms. Schakowsky, I yield the balance of my time to you.
Well, here we are again, and I want to reiterate just a bit what Representative Waxman has said. Clearly, we are witnessing the most anti-environment House of Representatives in American history. My colleague from Texas, the former chairman of this committee, was citing some of the things that have happened in Texas as a reason to undo some of the regulations that you proposed. But I just wanted to point out that under Governor Rick Perry's tenure, Texas has become far and away the nation's largest CO2 emitter. If Texas were its own country, as Mr. Perry has advocated in the past, it would be the 8th biggest polluter in the world. So it is high time that the Environmental Protection Agency continued in what has been a bipartisan tradition of protecting our environment, of protecting the health of Americans, and by the way, not destroying jobs in any way, but creating an opportunity for new 21st century clean jobs. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Time
Will the
has
gentlelady
expired.
yield to the
Her,
former
all her time has expired, so we're going to move now to swear in the Madam Administrator. Madam Administrator, you're aware that the committee is holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so has had the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to taking testimony under oath? No. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? In that case, if you please rise and raise your right hand, I will swear you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You are now under oath, and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. You may now give a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Please begin.
Thank you. Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to testify on the Environmental Protection Agency's regulatory process. It is a priority of the EPA and of this administration to ensure that our regulatory system is guided by science and that it protects human health and the environment in a pragmatic and cost-effective manner. One means by which this administration has made this priority clear is through Executive Order 13563, which includes a directive for federal agencies to develop a regulatory retrospective plan for periodic review of existing significant regulations. Under that directive, EPA has developed a plan which includes 35 priority regulatory reviews. Recent reforms, already finalized or formally proposed, are estimated to save up to $1.5 billion over the next 5 years. But let me be clear. The core mission of the EPA is protection of public health and the environment. That mission was established in recognition of a fundamental fact of American life. Regulations can and do improve the lives of people. We need these rules to hold polluters accountable and keep us safe. For more than 40 years, the agency has carried out its mission and established a proven track record that a healthy environment and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. The Clean Air Act is one of the most successful environmental laws in American history and provides an illustrative example of this point. For 40 years, the nation's Clean Air Act has made steady progress in reducing the threats posed by pollution and allowing us to breathe easier. In the last year alone, programs implemented pursuant to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 are estimated to have saved over 160,000 lives, spared Americans more than 100,000 hospital visits, and prevented millions of cases of respiratory problems, including bronchitis and asthma. Few of the regulations that gave us these huge gains in public health were uncontroversial at the time they were developed. Most major rules have been adopted amidst claims that they would be bad for the economy and bad for employment. In contrast to doomsday predictions, history has shown again and again that we can clean up pollution, create jobs, and grow our economy all at the same time. Over the same 40 years since the Clean Air Act was passed, the gross domestic product of the United States grew by more than 200%. Some would have us believe that job killing describes EPA's regulations. It is misleading to say that enforcement of our nation's environmental laws is bad for the economy and employment. It isn't. Families should never have to choose between a job and a healthy environment. They are entitled to both. We must regulate sensibly, in a manner that does not create undue burdens and that carefully considers both the benefits and the cost. However, in doing so, we must not lose sight of the reasons for implementation of environmental regulations. These regulations are necessary to ensure that Americans have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Americans are no less entitled to a safe, clean environment during difficult economic times than they are in a more prosperous economy. As President Obama recently stated in his joint address to Congress, what we can't do is let this economic crisis be used as an excuse to wipe out the basic protections that Americans have counted on for decades. We shouldn't be in a race to the bottom where we try to offer the worst pollution standards. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Madam Administrator. I'll open with my questions. I think, as you can see from opening statements from our side and the other side, this is a question of promoting economic growth, innovation, competition, and job creation. Is that your understanding of the principles that the agency must keep in mind when you make regulations?
Well,
yes or no?
Yes, but we must also implement the laws.
On the first day of the administration, you were directed to comply with a similar Executive Order 12866 in a memo from the White House. Is that true?
I believe that's right, sir.
Do you agree that the regulatory system must promote predictability and reduce uncertainty?
I think that's the advantage of the regulatory systems.
In the case of ground level ozone standards, you proposed in January 2010, were there discussions with the White House about the impact of reconsidering this rule prior to submitting a draft final rule to the White House?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, sir.
Okay, in January 2010,
Uh-huh.
when ground level ozone standards were proposed, was there discussion between you and the White House about simply the impact of what these would be on this country?
The proposal went through White House interagency review.
Did you meet and participate in discussions with the White House on those ozone standards?
I'm sure that staff in preparation
You
and in the
personally?
interagency review did.
Did you personally meet with the White House?
On the proposed package in January of 2010, not to my recollection.
Okay.
So.
If you recollect differently, if you'd be kind enough to submit to this committee who participated in those discussions, that would be helpful. Was there any reaction from the White House on the proposed ozone standards that were being proposed in January 2010? Do you recollect what the reaction was in the White House?
The fact
Did
that the
anyone in the White
proposal
House
went
say-
out shows that it cleared interagency review and was signed by me for public review.
So you assume the White House was on board fully?
I don't assume anything, sir. I'm giving you the facts as I know them.
Okay, so you're saying the White House reaction, as much as you know them, were supportive?
The agency exercised its discretion to make rulemaking after an interagency review that was conducted by and led by the White House.
I think there's a Chief of Staff memo, which you cited yourself in the proposed ozone reconsideration as rationale for that reconsideration that was ultimately done. It did not direct any agency to reconsider the regulations that were being finalized, published. Did you consult with the White House before you decided to reconsider the 2008 ozone standard?
That's the same question you asked before about the proposal, sir.
Okay.
So my answer is the same.
Okay. 3 weeks ago, the White House requested that you reconsider issuing the ozone rule, noting that the rule would not comport with the President's executive order and that our regulatory system must promote predictability and reduce uncertainty. Did you agree with the White House decision?
I respect the decision and I've implemented it.
Did you personally agree with it?
Well, I don't think it's a secret that that the recommendation we sent over and the package that we sent over was something different.
Yeah. And the reason why you disagreed with the White House is because you felt, was it that the standards you thought were imperative to be implemented? Can you give us your rationale why you still feel strongly that the ozone standards should be?
Sir Chairman, you're putting words in my mouth about what I feel, and my
I'm
feelings aren't actually germane here.
Okay. So at this point, all right. What changed between the time you proposed a regulation in January 2010 and September 2, 2011 to warrant reconsideration in your mind if you went along with them? I mean, here you're the administrator. You have strong feelings on this. You don't agree with the President. You're going ahead with it. Can you make some kind of rationale why you're going ahead with it now? I'm trying to understand it.
Well, the facts are that in between those two time periods, the President requested that we reconsider and do the reconsideration in light of new data that will come out such that that reconsideration will happen in 2013.
And what is that new data?
That is new public health data that will look at the connection between smog, ozone pollution, and asthma and other health indicators.
Do you think this goes back to what I asked you when I began my questions? Your idea is, my idea is, the agency has a responsibility to promote economic growth, innovation, competition, and job creation. Do you think that was part of the reasons why the President relaxed the standard and ozone standards?
Well, both the letter from Cass Sunstein and the President's statement explain his rationale, and they speak for themselves.
Did the White House propose this to you any other time than just recently?
Propose what, sir?
Relaxation of the ozone standards?
No,
that was the first time that came to you.
That was the first time they came to me. The President's actions and his statement and the letter from Mr. Sunstein was the official record of what happened with respect to that package.
All right, my time has expired. The gentlelady's recognized. Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Jackson, let me try to clear up some of the questioning about the new ozone standards that the chairman was pursuing. On September 1st, the administration announced that the EPA would not be revising the national ambient air quality standards for ozone. Is that right?
That's right.
And this decision, as you know, was controversial. It created a number of extremely important new questions about how we're going to handle the ozone standards going forward. So I'm wondering if you can tell us now, sitting here today, about the next steps you're going to be taking to ensure that states and localities have clear direction on what they should be doing with regard to ozone standards. I think it's important you clarify what you're going to be doing next.
Yes, ma'am. So we are going to proceed with the regular review in 2013, but simultaneously we are legally required to implement the standard that is on the books. The standard that is on the books now is the 2008 standard. It is 75 parts per billion, and EPA will be notifying states in the days ahead of the path forward in implementing that standard.
So what you're saying is it's the intention going forward that the EPA will enforce a 75% parts per million standard, the same as the Bush administration 2008 standard. Is that correct?
That's right. That's the legal standard on the books.
Okay. And can you assure us that states and localities will have sufficient time to meet those 2008 standards?
We will do it in a common sense way, minimizing the burden on state and local governments.
Thank you. Now, Administrator Jackson, the chairman was asking you about what the process is within the EPA about promulgating rules. And the EPA considers not just the effect on human health, but also the economic effect per the executive order that he was talking about, correct?
That is right. Our rules have always, at least as long as I've been there, considered costs and benefits of rules.
So, you know, one of the things that frustrates me and others is this sort of Sophie's choice that's been articulated that I don't think is true, that you either have to have jobs or high environmental standards. And I want to talk about the Clean Air Act, since we're talking about the Clean Air Act as an example. Since the Clean Air Act was signed in 1970, toxic air pollutants have gone down by 60% and saved hundreds of lives. And so that's the main goal of the Clean Air Act, correct?
The Clean Air Act's goal is to clean up the air and therefore make people healthier.
Right. But in addition, the economy has grown since the Clean Air Act was promulgated. Is that correct?
That's right. GDP has grown over 200%.
So GDP has grown over 200% since the Clean Air Act's passage, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Also, can you talk to us about the effect of the Clean Air Act on job creation?
Certainly. There have been numerous studies that show that the Clean Air Act has actually helped foster and grow a pollution control industry in this country that actually exports its innovations and technologies and, of course, puts them to work here on the ground. When we ask someone to spend money, millions or even billions, on pollution control, those are jobs that are generally produced here, everything from engineers to designers to welders to boilermakers. And
in fact, I read a study that said just in 2008, all of those things generated $300 billion in revenue and supported nearly 1.7 million jobs. I talked about that in my opening. Are you aware of that study as well?
That's the series study.
Yes.
Correct? Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Now, I also read a study from the University of Massachusetts that estimated that EPA's utility toxins and cross-state air pollution rules would generate 1.5 million new jobs by 2015. Are you familiar with that study?
Yes, generally.
Okay. And what kind of jobs will compliance with those regulations create?
Those regulations require companies to invest in pollution control, scrubbers or selective catalytic reducers. They're everything from working with steel workers or pipe fitters or engineers, designers, those who actually install and operate pollution control equipment or those who retrofit equipment. And their jobs, because it's the utility industry, it's the energy industry, it has to be done here. It's something that we have to do here to invest in ourselves.
Here
and our
in the
energy
United
industry.
States.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Administrator, in your opening statement, you said that the role of the EPA is to make sure that polluters are accountable. Do you consider an industry that is in compliance with EPA regulation to be a polluter?
An industry can have a permit and be in compliance with the permit and still be emitting pollution, yes.
But would, in your definition of a polluter, if an industry is actually complying, then why would you continue to call them a polluter as if they weren't complying?
Well, it's important for people to understand that in order to operate, there is an assumption that some amount of pollution into our air and water may have to happen. What we do, what our laws require EPA and states to do in their stead, is to ratchet down that pollution in the interest of the public health.
So would it be fair to say that in your definition, the only industry that would not be a polluter would be an industry that has no emissions at all? In other words, it was shut down.
If you don't emit pollution, then you are not a polluter. That is not to say that the emission of some amount of pollution is not permitted. That is the regulatory process.
Let me rephrase the question, Madam. Is it the goal of the EPA to get to zero emissions, i.e. basically shut down the U.S. economy?
Of course not, sir.
Okay, that's the right answer. You have appeared before this subcommittee and the full committee a number of times this year, and in at least 2 of those instances I have asked you to document some of these health benefits that EPA spokespersons and yourself continue to allude to as a reason for these new regulations. Unless your agency supplied them to my office last night or this morning, we've yet to receive them. Could you encourage them to actually give us the documents that document these repeatedly referred to health benefits?
Well, sir, I will say that the regulatory packages that we prepare include significant documentation of both the benefits and the cost of our
You're not answering my question. I don't think they exist.
You don't think health benefits from clean air exist?
No, I think health benefits from clean air do exist. I don't think some of these documents that you refer to exist. Are you to complied with the request to submit them?
Sir, I will check on any requests for outstanding documentation, but I would also refer you to the packages.
I'm giving you a request right now. I've given you respectfully request almost every time you have appeared before the subcommittee or the full committee. And, you know, when you look in the footnotes of some of these proposed regulations, they refer to studies that are 10 to 15 years old, usually very small studies, usually studies that are independent with no real peer-reviewed verification. And then we get these, you know, these huge cost-benefit comparisons, and in true science, you actually document what's going on. That does not appear to be the case at your EPA. And if they exist, then send them to us.
I disagree, but I will check again to see what else may be outstanding from your request, respectfully.
All right, let me make a comment on what Chairman Waxman said in his opening statement, that we have voted 125 times to weaken environmental regulation in this Congress. That's not true. There is a difference between voting to actually change or reduce an existing standard and voting to delay or slow down or at least review a proposed standard. This Congress has asked and voted to delay, review, go back and check on regulations, but I'm not aware that we have voted to actually change or weaken any standard that's already in effect. And I think that is a distinction that's worth noting. The regional administrator in Texas, Dr. Armendariz, in an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News earlier this week, expressed surprise that Texas industry was in attempting to comply with this cross-state air pollution regulation, actually beginning to shut down power plants and coal mines. He said in his op-ed that the EPA had reached out numerous times and tried to consult with and interact with the affected industries. Could you provide logs of those meetings, emails, and telephone conversations to actually document the regional administrator's assertion that he had been trying to work with the industries in Texas? Because when I check with the industry, they say that they have had almost no interaction and were absolutely blindsided by the inclusion of Texas in the cross-state air pollution rule at the very last moment with no ability to impact the regulation.
Sir, I'm happy to provide it. I would also just point you to the record of the cross-state air pollution reg rule, where EPA specifically took comment and received comment from Texas industries and Texas regulators about Texas's inclusion in both the summer.
After the fact. After
No, sir, during the public comment period.
They couldn't have, because Texas wasn't included in the rule.
There
is a one-paragraph mention of Texas possibly including at some future point. They were put into the rule at the last moment.
So Texas has been complying with the CARE rule that the Bush administration put in place. The cross-state rule is a replacement for that rule. We specifically took comment and put Texas on notice that besides summer NOx, ozone, smog requirements, we took comment on what would happen if they weren't in and what would happen if they were. So we have information submitted by Texas regulators and Texas companies.
Well, if you'll just comply with my
regular order, Mr.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman from California, the ranking member, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you propose a rule, you have to establish a record of the scientific basis for your findings. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And that relies on work that's been done by scientists, often, maybe always, peer-reviewed. Is that correct?
That is right. That work goes through peer review before we put it in the record for our rules.
And so if Mr. Barton wants to get the scientific backing for your rules, he can just simply look at the record.
Well, yes. Although, of course, if there is additional information we owe him, I will look to ensure he gets it.
Well, I've talked to Mr. Barton, and there's, as I understand it, a lot of scientific research that has been peer-reviewed on the question of the impact of carbon emissions, global warming, climate change. And yet Mr. Barton doesn't believe in the science, nor does anybody else on the other side of the aisle. They've all voted that they reject the idea that science has come up with this conclusion, and they reject the science as well. We hear about job-killing regulations, and I haven't seen anybody substantiate the job-killing part of the regulations, but we know that a lot of this pollution kills people, and we have that well documented. Isn't that an accurate statement?
That is accurate, sir.
I'd like to ask you about the Train Act, which will soon be debated on the House floor. Matter of fact, today.
Would the gentleman yield on?
No, I won't. I only have a limited time.
I'd like to see
the bill reported from the
one documented just one.
No, Mr.
Regular
Chairman,
order,
regular order. I want to ask you about the amendment that's going to be offered by Mr. Whitfield. The bill reported from the committee would indefinitely delay critical public health protections to reduce soot, smog, mercury, and other toxic air pollution from power plants. But the Whitfield floor amendment goes much further. It would nullify EPA's final cross-state air pollution rule and proposed mercury air toxics rule, and it requires EPA to start from scratch on both rules, which have already been years in the making. Administrator Jackson, how long have we been waiting for old, uncontrolled power plants to finally clean up, and how do these power plants compare with other sources of pollution?
The 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act first called for power plant toxics from power plants to be addressed. The good neighbor provisions in the rule, I believe, were added then as well, which is the basis for the cross-state air pollution rule. Power plants are the largest emitters in our country of soot and smog and mercury, and for that reason, prior administration, the Bush administration, tried to address through the Clean Air Interstate Rule and the Clean Air Mercury Rule, rules that were later overturned in court because they did not comply with the law and did not do an adequate job.
The Whitfield Amendment would ensure that power plants would not have to control toxic air pollution for at least 7 years or reduce sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide for at least 8 years. And those are minimum delays because the amendment would eliminate all Clean Air Act deadlines for the rules. In addition to these delays, the Whitfield Amendment changes the underlying Clean Air Act authorities for the rules. I'm concerned that these changes would block EPA from ever reissuing the rules. For air toxic, the Whitfield Amendment replaces the Clean Air Act's proven standard-setting criteria with an entirely new approach for power plants that appears to be completely unworkable. It requires EPA to set standards based on the 12% of power plants that are best performing in the aggregate for all toxic pollutants. Administrator Jackson, this would require you to decide whether a plant that emits more neurotoxins but less carcinogens is better or worse performing than a plant that emits more carcinogens but less neurotoxins. Is there any scientific basis for you to make such a decision, and how is such a decision likely to fare in the courts?
Well, sir, I think it would weaken and possibly destroy our ability to ever address those toxins, toxic pollutants, because that's not the way they work in our body. It's, you know, those pollutants all act together, and we have good science that documents the health effects of mercury and arsenic and lead and hydrochloric acid, but to try to pick between one or the other, I fear would simply make the rules subject to being overturned, and we would not get those protections.
This amendment would change the criteria for addressing pollution that is generated in one state but is blown by the wind and causes unhealthy air quality in a downwind state. States can't require polluters in upwind states to clean up, so the Clean Air Act includes a good neighbor provision directing EPA to ensure that upwind states clean up pollution that causes unhealthy air beyond their state boundaries. The Whitfield Amendment includes an amazing provision that prohibits EPA from relying on modeling for any rule to address cross-state pollution. Administrator Jackson, if EPA can't rely on modeling, what effect would this have on the agency's ability to issue another cross-state pollution rule to address ozone and particulate problems in downwind states?
Sir, if we're required to only use monitoring data, which of course we use, but without the modeling to go along with it, I don't believe we'll be able to issue a regional cross-state rule in the future ever, because we simply have to be able to use scientific modeling to address upwind sources of pollution.
And how are these rules that the Whitfield Amendment would strike, how are these rules, why are they so important to public health?
Well, I think looking at the mercury rule, for example, we talk about 6,800 to 17,000 avoided premature deaths a year once implemented, 120,000 avoided asthma attacks per year. The cross-state air pollution, $120 to $280 billion in benefits, which represent 13,000 to 34,000 avoided premature deaths and 400,000 avoided asthma attacks.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I want to say that Mr. Barton characterized the report. I'd like to offer my report to be in the record, and that is the 125 in our tally votes to weaken the key.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized. Mr. Murphy for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and welcome here, Administrator Jackson. On this discussion of deaths, premature deaths, etc., I'm trying to get some accuracy of this from a scientific standpoint. Now, EPA is responsible for setting the national ambient air quality standard at a level to protect public health, including sensitive subgroups with an adequate margin of safety. Am I correct? That's your mission?
Yes.
Thank you. And the current annual standard for fine particulate matter is 15 micrograms per cubic meter.
Yes.
Recent review suggests EPA might consider lowering it further to a level of 11. Am I correct?
Sir, we have not made any regulatory determination. That science is ongoing.
Are you considering a level of 11?
We're required by law to review that level every 5 years.
Thank you. And these standards are based on a review of science. Am I correct in that, too?
That's correct, sir.
External science advisors involved in that, or is it all within the agency?
Yes, Congress mandated that there be an external advisory board, the Clean Air Science Advisory Board, I believe is their name.
Thank you. In EPA's recent regulatory impact analyses for utility MAC, boiler MAC, cross-state air pollution rule, most of the deaths the EPA says are caused by particulate matter are at air quality levels much cleaner than the air standards require. So I'd like to show you a chart with some EPA estimates, a bar chart of estimated mortality by air quality. If we could have that show up on the screen. We've marked the level of the current particulate matter standard. And as you see, most of the estimated mortality is below the protective standard. See to the left of that line. Now let me look at the next slide. To make this easier, here's another bar chart. The tall bar represents EPA's estimate of deaths from all causes occurring where the air is cleaner than the current ambient air quality standard. And the short bar represents EPA's estimate of the deaths from all causes occurring at levels less clean than the ambient air quality standard. So a couple questions on that, Ms. Jackson. EPA's own documents raise an interesting question. Is it true that when you estimate the benefit of your regulations, you're assuming that clean air also kills people?
Sir, the whole point of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards is to define what is clean air. People deserve to know what level of air will actually make them less sick and avoid those premature deaths.
And I'm just trying to get to the science because it looks like clean air also is in the category of what's happened with this definition. So the EPA also says in the particulate matter risk assessment report that, quote, we do not have information characterizing, unquote, deaths for people whose air was determined to be clean by national standards. So reading EPA's own documents, it sounds like there is not evidence that clean air is associated with deaths. So could you please share with the committee any studies that show a causal or associative relationship between fine particulate matter and deaths at levels below what EPA calls lowest measured level? Is that something you can provide for us?
I'm happy to provide whatever science we have that shows the correlation, which is quite clear. It is not an assumed correlation between soot and death. When people breathe in high levels of soot or even moderate levels, that's why we are looking at the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. It causes premature death. People die before they should.
Thank you. Now, in the past, I believe EPA has said that they don't necessarily take into account with the regulations economic impact or job impact, but you waxed extensively on the issue of jobs created by pollution control industry. You said we export and grow pollution control industry, welders, designers, Boilermakers. I might add that my Boilermakers would like to be building some cleaner power plants here in the U.S. And also was brought up that the GDP has grown 200% since passage. Is this the cause and effect that by passing the Clean Air Act, we've caused a 200% growth in our economy?
No, sir, that wasn't my point. My point was, in contrast to people who say that the Clean Air Act is a job killer, the Clean Air Act has been around for 40 years and our economy has been fine.
But is it cause and effect? Are we causing? Because here's my question. In the last 10 years, we've lost 2.8 million jobs to China, and I think we would all agree. I mean, I think something like 16 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in China, and we've lost a lot of jobs to China, and I think we'd agree their air quality standards are not good. And my concern also is a lot of our manufacturers and others who find it cheaper for lots of reasons, not just air quality. I would put that in part of the mix of the issues along with currency manipulation, reverse engineering, cheating, et cetera. That may be one of the factors involved when it costs the cost of energy and compliance in this country. So my concern is, instead of just looking at the aspect of jobs being created related to the pollution control industry, which I think is important, I also want to make sure we're evaluating jobs lost if companies are leaving the nation, going there, and then not only re-importing products, but re-importing pollution. And is that something that your agency can give us some information on?
We do look at jobs impacts, especially for the rules that have been under discussion so far this morning. Let me also say that there are studies by economists that show that the costs of environmental regulation, the kinds of things we're talking about, are not really determinative of a company's decision. Labor costs, currency costs, some of the things you mentioned are much more important. These are very, very small.
I just want to make sure we're also looking at the import. I mean, I think it was sometime somewhere in the last century, someone referred to Pittsburgh as hell with the lid off because of levels of pollution and pretty nasty pollution. It's now quite a remarkably clean city. Unfortunately, that also means we don't have a steel mill in Pittsburgh at all anymore, too. But if you could provide that information. One other thing in my remaining time, last March when you were here, I asked you on a different topic related to our natural gas industry in Pennsylvania, if you could provide us some information, recommendations, an evaluation, if you think Pennsylvania's laws regarding natural gas are not adequate, or if the enforcement's not adequate. I'm still waiting for that document. If you would be so kind as to give me information, I'd like to advance it to Pennsylvania and with some recommendations, or I'd be glad to talk to you about that further later on.
Gentleman's time has
Happy
expired.
to talk to you about it.
Thank you.
The gentlelady, Jankowski, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to suggest that the gentleman from Pennsylvania, I think, made a very good argument that when we negotiate trade agreements, that environmental concerns ought to be part of that we want to make sure that not only are we looking at the benefits or detriment to commerce, but that the world environment is also in those trade agreements. I wanted to get back to the mercury and air toxic rules that actually are being considered for overturning, essentially, or at least diminishing on the floor today. And there were actually, my understanding is, 800,000 comments in favor of those rules that were submitted, and wondered if you could respond to the reaction to those words, to the rules that were offered.
Yeah, I can confirm the exact number for you, ma'am. But the idea of cutting mercury pollution is very popular with the American people, and most Americans are shocked when they find that power plants are allowed to emit unlimited amounts of mercury and other toxics like arsenic and lead into their communities. They want the power, of course, but they've even said that they understand that we need to invest to ensure we have clean power in our communities, because they don't want their children exposed to toxic mercury. They don't want those impacts on their neurological development.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about. If you could describe for us, what are the public health consequences of what we're seeing today, the Republican efforts to kill this rule?
Without doubt, if this rule is delayed or, God forbid, killed in any way, there will be more premature deaths, more hospital admissions, more people getting sick because of increased levels of everything from mercury to soot, as we heard earlier, to arsenic, to lead, to hydrochloric acid, to hydrofluoric acid. In the case of the cross-state air pollution, the entire third of the country, which is quite populated, I think it's a third or more of our population, will be subject to air pollution that they can do nothing about, because EPA is now, its hands are tied and cannot stop upwind sources from affecting people, especially our children and our elderly, who are most susceptible to those premature deaths and those asthma and bronchitis attacks.
We'll also see adverse effects to wildlife as well, right? So there's...
Yes, I don't mean to minimize it, but the environment from the loads of those pollutants is harmed. Of course, the example most Americans know is acid rain, the idea that the SOx pollution, the SO2, goes into our atmosphere, comes down in the form of rain that is acidic, and it changes the chemistry of our lakes and harms our forests and our plants and wildlife.
I also wanted to reemphasize something I heard you say earlier, that there was actually a congressional mandate in 1990 to do this.
That's right.
And so we have failed for 21 years to actually live up to that mandate?
We have not, until this point, been able to make rules that have survived court challenge. And every one of those years of delay is more mercury. Mercury accumulates in the environment. So once it's there, it's deposited and it stays. The way you are exposed to mercury is you eat fish. And the way it gets there is that it comes out of the air, it deposits into our lakes and streams.
I wanted to also ask you about the cross-air pollution rule. Why did the EPA find it necessary to act to ameliorate cross-state air pollution? What would be the impact of the Republican efforts to repeal this rule?
Well, as I mentioned, first we were compelled to do so by the courts. The courts overturned the Clean Air Interstate Rule, which was promulgated in the last administration and in the Bush administration. And when in remanding it, gave it back to EPA and said, I will let this rule stand because I don't want to lose the health benefits of this rule such that they are in the market, because it's a market-based program, and while EPA fixes it. The cross-state air pollution rule is the replacement for that rule. And the reason it's important is because of the 13,000 to 34,000 premature deaths avoided and the 400,000 avoided asthma attacks. Those are just two of the significant and severe public health impacts that will be lost if we lose or delay those rules.
I thank you, and I thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. Gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Administrator, thank you for being with us this morning. There has been some discussion about the generalities, and I want to talk with you about the specifics. I think we've had some discussion of where does the rubber meet the road, and how do these rules and regulations affect companies and affect employees. And I've got an example. This is the labeling requirements for EPA container rules that went into effect on August 17th, 2011. It's, I think, a great example of the negative impact that the regulations are having on our economy, and specifically Buckman Labs, which is an international chemical company located in Tennessee. To be compliant with these new labeling regulations from the EPA container rule, Buckman Labs had to change all of their targeted their labels and send them to the EPA for approval. Not surprisingly, EPA did not send some of the new labels back to Buckman until just 1 week before the new regulation went into effect, and then Buckman Labs had to rush the EPA-approved labels to their clients for approval, as well as 50 states where the product is sold, just so that they could continue to maintain existing business. This was not for new business. This was for existing business. And to put this into perspective, we aren't talking about just a small handful of labels. We're talking about 4,000 labels that had to be reviewed and had to be changed to meet compliance, requiring the hiring of temporary employees whose sole job is to work on compliance for this one rule. So, did this new labeling rule actually change the contents of the product?
I would have to
These
look
were
into
for
the specifics, but I
microbicides.
assume it's a
These were
pesticide labeling
microbicides.
rule under
They are.
FIFRA. So I would look, but I would suppose not. Perhaps you know.
You're correct. It did not. It didn't. Was there any type of economic impact study conducted before this new rule went into effect, and how many jobs it was protected to create or projected to create?
I can
all
get
look
you
at that.
specifics on the rule. I don't have them in front of me. It sounds like some people got hired, though, which is a good thing.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is that the cost of compliance goes up, which means that these companies are not hiring new workers. The cost of 4,000 labels, the slowing of the process of business. Buckman Labs and the microbicides issue and the relabeling issue is a perfect example of how this slows the wheels of commerce, and how it's an added cost and an added expense for these companies who are trying to create jobs. And, you know, this is money that could have been spent for R&D. It is money that could have been spent for additional employees in this process, but yet they had to go through this compliance. Now, yesterday, they received notice that 5 more chemical product labels must be altered to meet the EPA label language changes that will require them that they're going to have to spend more time and more money to go through the process again. Can you see how the uncertainty, or do you have an understanding of how the uncertainty that your agency is causing is affecting the businesses that are in my state?
Certainly, I would not argue that regulations and standard setting for safety and health don't have impacts on business, but we're happy to look at this specific issue, but remember that the pesticide laws and regulations are for the safety of the users of those pesticides. So
Ms.
whatever is
Jackson,
being put
we are
on the
all
label.
for clean air, clean water, and a safe
Thank you.
environment. There is no argument about that. What we are looking at is the cost-benefit analysis of this. We are looking at the added burden, which in the case of Buckman Labs, it didn't change what the composition is. It didn't change any of the content. It was an added regulation. This is specifically the point. You know, if you can't argue about the fact that we are all for clean air, clean water, and a clean environment. What we are saying is the manner in which all of these new regulations, you have put out over nearly 1,000 new regulations since you all went in at the EPA. The cost to our small businesses now, Chamber of Commerce says, is about $10,000 per employee. The cost to families who are losing their jobs. We started our job creator listening sessions the first of the year and working with our small businesses and our employers in our district. The overreach of the EPA comes up regularly, and it is of concern to us. I yield back.
Gentlelady, Dr. Christensen is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator Jackson. Let me just say before I ask my question that as a representative of a district with one of the highest concentrations of greenhouse gases, I really thank EPA for its continued support and help to the people of the Virgin Islands, and also as a member of a racial minority whose communities are often where some of the most polluting industries are placed. We thank you for your commitment to environmental justice. And I've had the opportunity to see you work and see how you always work towards solutions which protect health and safety while still ensuring and even stimulating economic growth in communities across the country. And the Congressional Black Caucus looks forward to recognizing your work this weekend.
It's quite an honor.
So despite, the agency's tremendous record when it comes to producing sensible regulations to protect the environment while stimulating innovation that drives economic growth, that's not what we're hearing from the other side of the aisle. Republicans on the committee and in the House appear to be living in an alternate reality when it comes to environmental regulation. For example, in a markup of legislation last week that would stymie your agency's efforts to protect the air we breathe and bring regulations implementing Clean Act into compliance with the law, finally after all this time, Representative Burgess suggested that EPA's Boiler Act rule would not provide, and I'm quoting here, would not provide one scintilla of improvement in the air we breathe. Ms. Jackson, your agency's rulemaking process for Boiler Act rule was extensive, and you issued a 232-page impact analysis. Is Mr. Burgess correct that the Boiler Act rule he promulgated would not improve air quality one scintilla?
No, that's not correct.
Okay. Would you care to elaborate?
Sure. EPA estimates show that for every $5 spent on reducing pollution, on pollution control, there are $12 worth of public health benefits. That's in reduced mercury, soot, and other toxic pollutants.
And, he's not alone in his refusal to accept scientific facts supporting EPA regulatory action. At a hearing at this committee earlier this year, former Chairman Barton spoke strongly against the Clean Air Act regulations that would address dangerous emissions from power plants. And in opposing these regulations, he suggested that mercury emissions, which we've heard a lot about this morning, cause no threat to human health. You've spoken generally about the mercury, the impact of mercury and the fact that it's cumulative in the environment. Would you say something about the impact, especially on the health of children?
Certainly, mercury, as I noted, is a neurotoxin. It affects developing brain cells, and it can affect those cells whether a child has been born or is still in the womb. and lowered IQ points are generally the way that mercury impacts are measured. Recently, EPA Science Advisory Board peer-reviewed data to show that those impacts are real.
Thank you, Administrator Jackson. I believe it's our fundamental duty to protect our children against these dangers, and the only way to argue otherwise is really to ignore decades of science on mercury emissions. Unfortunately, denying basic scientific facts seems to become a requirement for the other side of the aisle serving on the committee. I don't have to remind you that in March of this year, every single Republican member of this committee voted to deny the very existence of global warming. So, Administrator Jackson, is there any legitimate scientific debate about the existence of global warming?
Climate change, global warming has been reviewed by numerous scientific panels, and the results remain the same, which is that the climate is changing, and that human activities and particularly emissions of global warming gases, of climate-forcing gases, are a primary cause.
And as you've stated, according to a study conducted by the National Academy of Sciences, 97% of scientists believe not simply that climate change exists, but that humans are causing it. Notwithstanding that overwhelming scientific consensus, my colleagues on the other side are throwing in their lot with a handful of radical outliers in order to block meaningful governmental action to protect our children from rising temperatures, rising tides, and their devastating consequences. So denying the problem is really is not a way to solve them. Let me ask one more question. Would reducing or terminating the, quote, lowest priority programs in accordance with the Accountable Government Initiative result in cost savings significant enough to justify the termination of those programs?
I'd have to ask you to be a little bit more specific. We are certainly committed to making sure that we are as efficient as possible with our budget. And our budget is such that we can't fund every single program that we're actually required by law to implement. So we are making those kinds of hard choices right now.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony, and thank you for being here.
Ladies, time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much has been said on the other side that I need to refute, and yet there are some things that I need to get out here. First off, it would be of great help to me if you would provide us the actuarial data that you are using to support the statement that 13,000 to 34,000 lives would be lost if your regulations do not go forward. And then I would further ask the question, I'm sure you made the President aware of this. Does the President not care about the health of Americans by delaying the ozone rule?
So the President can speak for himself, but I think his statement makes clear why he made the decision he made.
Well, that's part of the point. Of course, there was a recent Nobel scientist who resigned from his membership in the American Physical Society because of the position that society took on global warming. And I think, paraphrasing his statement, we can sit around for hours and argue about the constant mass of a proton, but we're not able to discuss whether or not the validity of the science on climate change is valid or not. And people of goodwill and good intention can disagree about things. And Chairman Waxman, Ranking Member Waxman, said that we don't believe in the science. Well, yeah, that's right. I believe in God. The science actually should be proven, and if it is true science, it should be provable, and that is what the argument is about. Now, let me ask you this, because it is important on this cross-state air pollution rule. It does affect Texas in a big way. We were faced with the possibility of rolling blackouts this last August because of the electricity usage during the month of August. And now we are told that with the introduction of the cross-state air pollution rule, in the time frame as provided by the rulemaking at the EPA, that 8 to 18 power plants may be shuttered on January 1st. And that will put, obviously, a significant restriction on the ability to deliver electricity in the state of Texas. And I would argue that that's going to have a significant impact on public health because, as we all know, people can die in the cold, but they really can die in large numbers in unair-conditioned homes during the hot summer months. did you coordinate, the EPA, did you coordinate with FERC as to the implementation of this rule as the discussions were going forward?
Sir, in looking at our, EPA did a reliability analysis and asked FERC and Department of Energy to review that.
How did you coordinate the information that was provided?
As EPA did its analysis, we asked for review and comment on the analysis that we did.
And did we just ignore FERC's recommendations? Because they don't seem to be completely coincident with the decisions that you made.
No, not at all, sir. In fact, in my own personal conversations with Chairman Wellinghoff and others at DOE, what we've assured them is that we would work with states and others to ensure the Clean Air Act's perfect record of never having caused a reliability incident in its 40-year history.
Well, let me ask you this. Will you provide for this committee all of the relevant memos, communications, letters, emails that are available?
Certainly, sir.
And what time frame might we expect those?
As soon as we can, sir.
I might suggest that there is a time frame that could be suggested to you, but I will leave that up to the chairman. Now, I have here a letter to you from the Southwest Power Pool, a regional transmission organization on electrical reliability. The Southwestern Power Pool supports a more flexible approach to meeting the emission requirements under CASPAR, and they cite several operators who are of similar opinion. They go on to say the EPA must provide time to allow the industry to plan an approach to comply with its rules in a reliable and reasonable fashion. As it stands now, the Southwest Pool and its members may be placed in the untenable position of deciding which agency's rules to violate, EPA or the FERC's. Putting an industry with a critical infrastructure in the position of choosing which agency's rules to violate is bad public policy. Editorial comment, I agree. They also suggest that the EPA delay CASPAR's effective date by at least a year to allow for investigating, planning, and developing solutions. What would be the problem with delaying for a year?
The rule is flexible enough because it is a market-based program that is intended to replace a rule that was remanded to EPA by the courts.
Well,
we are under obligation to continue
with all
the
due
public health
respect,
protection.
people in the industry do not agree with you. I'm not sure FERC agrees.
Sir, in 40 years, the Clean Air Act has never caused a reliability problem. I am confident that this rule can be implemented in a way that lets businesses make the decisions they need but doesn't sacrifice public health.
And what if you're wrong? Are you infallible?
Of course I'm not. But
Well,
a 40-year
would you
history
provide
shouldn't be
to
ignored,
the
sir, just
committee-
because of
will
doomsday
you
scenarios by
provide to-
those who want to stop the public health protections in this rule.
Well, and I disagree that they want to stop the public health protections, and that is the overreach of which the agency is guilty. But will you provide us the response to the letter to the Southwest Power Pool that they have posed to you?
If they were submitted during the public comment period, we may already have it, but I'm happy to give you a response if it
Submitted
exists.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, emeritus of the full committee, Mr. Engel, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your courtesy. Ms. Jackson, welcome. I want to thank you for your visit to Southeast Michigan last month and your tour of the Detroit River International Refuge, of which you know I'm very interested. I have a number of questions to which I would hope you would answer yes or no. One, does EPA take public comments into consideration during its rulemaking?
Yes.
Does EPA allow industry representatives to provide comments during the rulemaking process?
Yes, sir.
Does EPA take into account during the rulemaking process a cost analysis of the proposed rules' effect on industry and the costs of that?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Now, as I remember the writing of the legislation, the EPA is required to, in writing these rules, to come first to its decisions on the basis of health, and then to come to further decisions on how the rule will be implemented on the basis of other things as well. In other words, cost and impact on industry and things of that kind. Is that right?
That's generally correct, sir. Yes.
And so if I'm correct, then the Train Act would change the sequence of those things. The first decision would be cost. The second decision is about the rule. And the second decision would then be how the health of people is going to be affected by the different circumstances in which the rule is directed. Is that right?
I believe that's right, or it may be the latter amendment that would amend the Train Act to do that, or the latter.
Now, would you briefly state what effect you think there would be if the cost basis analysis is done before the scientific health benefit analysis?
I think it would require the American people to be kept in the dark about what is happening to their health and about what is clean air. It is analogous to a doctor not giving a diagnosis to a patient because the patient might not be able to afford the treatment. The American people have the right to know whether the air they breathe is healthy or unhealthy.
Well, now, how are you going to assess the cost if you don't know what the problem that you are addressing might be? I'm trying to understand. We're going to have a big proceeding to define cost, and then we're going to, after we've defined the cost, we're going to decide about the health and what we're going to do. I find this rather curious. How are we going to be able to assess the cost if we don't know what is going to be required to be done?
I see. Yeah, I'm not sure, sir. I don't know what the thinking is there.
Just for my own curiosity, there have been a lot of major changes proposed to the Clean Air Act, and I'm sure you'll remember that over the years I have not been entirely happy about either the Clean Air Act or the administration of it by EPA. But how many times have you been called upon by the Congress to testify on these proposed changes?
I believe it's approaching a dozen, sir, but we can get you the exact number.
Please, if you would. Now, as I've mentioned, my colleagues on the committee know I've had some very major disagreements with EPA over the rules. And there are a lot of serious issues that need to be addressed in the Clean Air Act and other policies. And from time to time, I have been worried that the industry will bear an undue burden as a result of EPA rules. Those concerns still exist today in places. I got to say that I'm disappointed, Mr. Chairman, that this committee has decided not to address these issues head-on through legislation and specific courses of action. Instead, we've been running around following false paper trails, taking issues out of context, ignoring policies already in place, instead of finding legitimate and balanced solutions to protect the economy and the environment, and having hearings in which we address the concerns of industry to find what the specific concerns are and what the particular actions of this committee should be to address those concerns and see to it that we're addressing with proper focus and diligence the questions of protecting the economy, jobs, and at the same time addressing the problems of the environment. I note that my time is up, and I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Gingrich is recognized for 5 minutes. Gentleman from Georgia.
Madam Administrator, thank you for appearing before the committee. Your response to the gentleman from Michigan in regard to what comes first in consideration of the EPA rulemaking, and your response was health and protecting the health of the American people comes first. And I think your response also to what comes second was other things, including cost. Is that correct? Was that essentially your response to the gentleman from Michigan's line of questioning?
Yes, with respect to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and the Clean Air Act.
Right.
Yes.
If the gentleman would yield, that is required in the statute. Something that caused me a lot of trouble.
Reclaiming my time, and I appreciate that. But the EPA, and this is the reason I bring this up, the EPA counts benefits from protecting people from clean air. They don't actually believe that there's a risk at those levels, but they're counting the benefits. So we're concerned about overstating the benefits in regard to health and understating the risk to the economy. Yes or no? is it true that the administrator of EPA, yourself, has the responsibility to set ambient air quality standards to protect the public health, including sensitive subgroups, with an adequate margin of safety?
Yes, sir.
And again, yes or no, is it true that the administrator, yourself, considers advice from EPA staff and also advice from the science advisors on the Clean Air Act Science Advisory Committee in setting those standards?
Yes, sir.
Now, EPA staff in their particulate matter report say that there is no evidence of health effects at levels much lower than the level EPA calls the, quote, lowest measured level. Is that your understanding?
Sir, I know that would make sense to me, that below the lowest measure level there may be no effects, or effects that would be hard to attribute because you couldn't measure the pollutant.
Right, so the answer is yes, and I thank you for that. Now, according to the most recent particulate matter risk assessment, EPA estimates, and I quote, that total particulate matter 2.5 micron related premature mortality ranges from 63,000 and 88,000 each year above the lowest measured level. Of course, that's a large number. Would you agree? 63,000 to 88,000?
It's a lot of premature deaths.
It represents, in fact, Madam Administrator, between 3 and 4% of all deaths in the United States annually. But now I turn to the recent transport rule, which, of course, we have concerns over, and to its estimates of benefits which involve almost all particulate matter, and note that the benefit range between 130,000 and 320,000 deaths per year. That's quite different from EPA's own integrated science assessment. So how do you explain that?
I'm sorry.
Well, let me say it again. The most recent transport rule and to its estimate of benefits, which involve almost all particulate matter. And note that the benefits range between 130,000 and 320,000 deaths per year. As I said, that's quite different from 63,000 to 88,000 from EPA's own integrated science assessment. How do you explain that delta?
The number I have, sir, is 13,000 to 34,000 avoided premature deaths under the cross-state air pollution rule. Perhaps our numbers should be reconciled, but that's what I have, and I believe that's directly from the rule and the regulatory impact analysis.
Well, I would like, Madam Administrator, for you to clarify that for me, and I would appreciate that very much. Because the question becomes, and as I said at the outset, is the EPA modifying the numbers to exaggerate the benefits? Is the EPA claiming benefits below the level where the data support such claims? How can EPA promulgate rules and put out numbers that represent 2- and 3-fold increases over the agency's own scientific assessment? Would you agree, Madam Administrator, would you agree that this does raise legitimate questions about overestimating the health benefits?
No, respectfully, because I don't believe I agree with your numbers, sir, so I can't agree with your premise.
Well,
you know, it was briefed not long ago by scientists who said simply, these are scientists who study fine particle pollution, that if you could reduce the levels down to levels that would be considered doable technologically, you could have an impact on public health.
Let me interrupt you just for a second, Madam Administrator. With all due respect, and I do respect you, I've only got, in fact, I'm a little bit over time, but it's kind of like this business of the stimulus bill saving jobs. It didn't grow jobs, but of saving jobs. And you put out numbers in regard to saving lives. That's much more important, and that has to be accurate. So thank you for getting that information to me in a timely manner, and I know I've gone over, so yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor. Welcome her to the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Administrator. You know, coming from Florida, we really appreciate our clean water and clean air because jobs and the economy are directly tied to having clean air and clean water. And I just have to, you know, this past week on Monday was the 1-year anniversary of finally closing off the BP Deepwater Horizon well, and there's no better example to explain why rational regulations need to be in place to protect not just the environment, but when the environment is tied to the economy and jobs. And I know we, of the last 30 years even, we've seen a very predictable pattern when the EPA goes to carry out the direction of the Congress under the law and the will of the American people. There's this typical tug of war that ensues. You'll propose a regulation, then certain industries will weigh in, local citizens, maybe the Heart and Lung Association. And I think this is very healthy. I think a robust exchange of ideas and looking at all of these regulations is essential to getting to the right result. It can be messy and it can be very contentious sometimes, and sometimes folks here in Washington have very high-paid lobbyists that can weigh in, and it's important to have a balance from people at home that oftentimes don't have the same voice. But I think if EPA sticks to the science, and if you fairly consider all industry points of view, and you consider rational alternatives, is there a less costly alternative? I think if we follow the science, we'll get to the right point. And I'll have a couple of examples. When EPA announced plans to control benzene emissions from chemical production plants, remember that industry claimed pollution controls would cost over $350,000 per plant. But instead, technological innovation led to replacement of benzene with other chemicals, and the compliance costs turned out to be zero. Administrator Jackson, is this sort of innovation unusual in the face of new environmental regulation?
No, and indeed, to the contrary, it is the pattern. For example, the industry overstated the per-ton cost of the acid rain trading program by a factor of 4. And what happens is that once industry puts its mind to complying instead of fighting, they learn to do it in a way that is more cost-effective than the current technology, and we get both cleaner air and water and jobs as well.
And there's a great example just in the home district from decades ago. We had a coal-fired power plant by the local electric company. They were in litigation, and rather than proceed down litigation, the business took a hard look at the new technologies available to clean the air, and to settle that, they invested in the new technology on scrubbers. And this has been the best business decision for them. Not only has it earned them great PR, but has cleaned the air. It's right on Tampa Bay. The health of Tampa Bay has improved. We don't have as much atmospheric deposition coming onto the water. And I think oftentimes if the science and technology proves out to be the best business decision. Another example, when EPA announced limits on chlorofluorocarbons in vehicle air conditioners, the auto industry insisted they would add up to $12,000 or $1,200 to the price of every car. But the real cost turned out to be as low as $40. So in that case, did the benefits to eliminating chlorofluorocarbons outweigh this $40 cost, in your opinion?
Yes, I'm sure they did, although I don't know the exact ratio. But because the cost was so much less, they already outweighed it when we proposed the rule, but the happy coincidence of innovation is that it's much cheaper than we expected.
Why do you think this is the case? Why do affected industries and their high-paid lobbyists up here, why do they so often overestimate the costs?
There's become this dance that's done inside Washington where we propose public health protections in accordance with the law, and then the costs are overstated, and even though the history shows that is not the impact, it seems to me to be devoid of concern for the real people who would be most effective, and that's the American people who want clean air and clean water, and of course they want jobs as well, and I believe we can have all three.
I agree. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and a lot of these examples prove that out. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Administrator Jackson, has there been an air district anywhere in the country if not in the world, that's reduced its total emissions more than the South Coast Air Base in Los Angeles?
I can double check that, but they've made significant reductions, sir.
Significant.
They still have significant challenges, but they've made big reductions.
Do you think that the question is there another non-attainment area anywhere in the state, the country that has more regulatory control over emissions than Los Angeles, the South Coast Air Basin?
California, because of their specific challenges, I think has older and probably more well-established air pollution regulations in general.
And are you aware also, too, that California and the Air Resources Board and the air districts have been the leader in, not just nationally, but worldwide in air pollution reduction? And
yes,
technology.
And technology and moving forward on trying to address public health issues associated.
And you are aware that we have one of the highest, except second only to Nevada, of unemployment right now. 12 point plus.
I'm sorry, sir.
Okay. Look, both sides can talk about denial of impacts, health-wise, economic. Let's be upfront. Anybody that straight-faced says we can do these regulations and they will help the environment and drive the economy is still playing in our 1970 illusion that there isn't an impact on both sides. And I don't think either side should be in denial that there is a cost to the economy and a benefit to the environment. And if you retreat on some of these environmental issues, there's going to be an impact on the environment and health and a benefit to the economy. It goes back and forth. The concept that we can pull this off, we've been playing this game in California long enough. We have tried to do, we've done extraordinary things in California to try to make it both work out. There is a cost, and there's a cost both ways, and I think that seriously we need to address that. Now let me ask you, and that's why the dialogue here gets polarized. I want to bring this back to there's cost and benefit. Don't deny the cost, don't deny the benefit. Now my question is, in the 1970s, isn't it true that through environmental regs and fuel efficiency regs, the federal government drove the private sector towards diesel operation for about 5 to 6 years? They converted their fleet to a large degree over to diesel.
Oh, I can't confirm that, sir.
Okay, well, I'll confirm it for you because I think those of us that are old enough to remember that will remember that hideous experiment. That was an environmental regulation that drove the private sector to diesel, which you and I know is a very, very toxic emission, a very big health issue. And it was a major economic and environmental mistake that we made. And there are impacts on that. I'd like to shift over from the other side as somebody who's been on the rulemaking, actually been in the regulations. What is the responsibility or what is the participation of local and state and county government operations in the implementation of these rules? And I'll point that out. You're the Environmental Protection Agency. You're not the EDA. You're not the Economic Destruction Agency. What is the local and state responsibility in addressing air pollution and toxic emissions, and what is their major goal and participation in this process? And
Well,
please make it short.
Okay, at a minimum, state governments are primarily responsible for implementation of most aspects of the Federal Clean Air Act. Some states have their own laws, and in the case of California, local and county governments do as well.
How much reduction have we had in government operations and procedures in emissions in a non-attainment area like the LA Air Basin in comparison to the private sector reduction? Wouldn't you agree that probably overwhelmingly in the 90% that the private sector has reduced their emissions in proportionally, that the reduction has been in the private sector, and the public sector has been less than very aggressive at reducing our emissions and our operations to reduce our footprint?
So I'm not sure I understand the question, but the private sector has not done it voluntarily.
Let me give you this. If the EPA had a scientist coming out of Kansas that could tell you that you could reduce the emissions from autos by 20% with a single regulation, don't you think the EPA would be very interested in looking at implementing those rules?
Of course, we're always looking for ways.
What are you doing about the mobile sources caused by inappropriate traffic control by city, county, and local and state government.
Sir, we are implementing the Clean Air Act, and we allow states to come up with implementation plans to determine how best to reduce most forms of air pollution. The mercury and air toxic standards are different because they're under a different section of the Clean Air Act.
I move right back over. In other words, local government, states, government our job is to make the private sector clean up their act. But where you can get identified single mobile source that government controls, that we have done nothing as a comprehensive approach to reduce it, because we focused on cracking down on the private sector, who are the job generators, while we're given a free ride. And Mr. Chairman, I point this out because that 20% that we could reduce in government is 20% that the private sector wouldn't have to do while they're laying off employees. And that's the kind of responsible environmental strategy. I'd like to see both sides of the aisle finally be brave enough to
And I think
approach.
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This week, the Republicans have stepped up their assault on clean air and clean energy. Both this committee and the full House have begun a legislative repeal-a-thon that denies the science, delays the regulations, and deters efforts to protect the health and security of millions of Americans. Take today's floor action. We're having 100-year floods every few years. We have had tornadoes rip through the country, killing people and destroying property. Hurricanes have caused floods, massive power outages, and deaths. Texas is on fire. 48 states have made emergency declarations so far this year. And we have set all-time records of 83 major disasters declared this year, with 3 months of the year still left to go. The planet is warming, and the weather is worsening. We see it here with our hurricanes, floods, fires, and tornadoes. We see it overseas, where famine in Somalia threatens civil war. And how does the Tea Party respond? Maybe we can find the money, they say, for disaster relief for people who are suffering, for people who are desperate, for people who have lives who have been altered permanently by these disasters, but we're going to make the taxpayer pay. Do the Republicans say we are going to pay by cutting the hundreds of billions of dollars we spend on our nuclear weapons program? Because we all know we don't need to build any more nuclear weapons. Oh, no. They wouldn't do that. Are we going to cut the tens of billions of dollars in subsidies we give to big oil and coal as they report record profits? Oh, no. We can't touch those, they say. We can't even talk about cutting those programs. What can we talk about? We can talk about, they say, cutting the Clean Car Factory Fund. We can talk about cutting the incentives to make super efficient cars that don't need the oil sold by potentates in Saudi Arabia and CEOs in Texas. We can talk about cutting the program that could remove the need for the very same oil that creates the greenhouse gases that are warming up the planet and causing the disasters that cost more and more money to remedy as each year goes by. And as if all this wasn't enough, the Republicans are also waging an all-out war on the Clean Air Act. This committee in the House has already passed legislation to prevent the EPA from doing anything to reduce the amount of oil used by our cars and trucks. And this week, in this committee and on the floor, we are considering bills to require endless study of the cumulative impacts of all EPA air regulations on all industries. And then, just for good measure, we're going to pass legislation that repeals the regulations that have already been set, extend the deadlines for implementation of the rest, and weaken the very underpinnings of the Clean Air Act. The Republicans are providing the American people with a false choice. We do not have to choose between air quality and air conditioning. We do not have to choose between concrete and cancer. We do not have to choose between manufacturing and mercury poisoning or asthma or cardiac arrest. We do not have to choose. In their insistence that we consider the cumulative impacts of all these regulations, there are some other cumulative impacts of their actions that Republicans refuse to acknowledge. Administrator Jackson, Republicans are cutting programs to incentivize the development of advanced technology vehicles that could run without using a single drop of oil. There also passed legislation preventing EPA from moving forward to require a 54.5 miles per gallon fuel economy standard by 2025. When you look at this cumulatively, as Republicans say we must, do you think these actions would help or hurt our efforts to reduce our dependence on foreign oil and back out that which we take from OPEC and funds those countries' governments?
I think efforts to make us more dependent on gasoline hurt our nation's energy independence, sir.
Cumulatively, what are the benefits of cleaning up particulate matter? Does that help or hurt our efforts to battle cancer, to battle the impact that it has upon the health of people in our country?
Particulate matter or soot causes premature deaths. It doesn't make you sick. It's directly causal to dying sooner than you should. So the impacts of delaying efforts, cost-effective efforts, I might add, to address particulate matter are more people dying sooner than they should.
How would you compare it to the fight against cancer, reducing particulate matter?
Yeah, I was briefed not long ago. If we could reduce particulate matter to healthy levels, it would have the same impact as finding a cure for cancer in our country.
Can you say that sentence one more time?
Yes, sir. If we could reduce particulate matter to levels that are healthy, we would have an identical impact to finding a cure for cancer.
That's a pretty good cumulative impact.
Well, and the difference is we know how to do that.
And the Republicans are also proposing to delay and weaken standards that would remove toxic chemicals like mercury, benzene, cancer-causing dioxin, and lead from industrial polluters. Your regulations clean up cement plants. When you look at these health effects cumulatively, as Republicans insist we must, and the Tea Party insists we must, would we be avoiding the thousands of deaths that otherwise would occur?
Gentleman's time has expired.
And that's $2 trillion in health benefits a year beginning in 2020, sir.
Okay,
and that's just some of the rules.
I thank the gentleman. I'm glad he finally got to his question.
Well, I was asking, well, let me just say this, for the sake of the discussion. Mr. Bilbray did not ask his question until 1:05 after the time. And Mr. Gingrey did not ask his question until 26 seconds after his own. I'm glad you noticed. If you would have notified them as well, then I think I probably would have understood what the rules were.
There's no rules. You can do what you want on your 5 minutes.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Griffith from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
When you say reduce particulate matters to levels that are healthy, what is that level?
I don't have it in my head right now, but we'll get it to you, sir.
And can you tell me, when you're getting that information, at what point in history we were at that level? Because isn't it not true that a lot of particulate matter exists from natural causes?
Some amount of fine particulate matter, but most of the natural causes of particulate matter are coarser, and so dust. When you hear about dust storms, there is some particulate matter, of course, that's emitted naturally.
Sure. So if you could give me a date as to when the Earth achieved that maximum healthy level, I'd appreciate that. At some point back in the past, I'm sure your scientists can help you with that. In regard to mercury, we've heard a lot about mercury today, but the Department of Energy says that when it goes back and looks at mercury, and this was just found on the Department of Energy's website, that even in 1995, coal-fired power plants in the United States contributed less than 1% of the world's mercury in the air, and that since that time, we've actually dropped. And I guess my question is because we hear this all the time in this committee, that we must be against clean air, that we must be, because we don't support all the EPA proposals, that we must be for dirty air. In fact, I believe Chairman Emeritus Waxman said yesterday this was Dirty Air Week. The Republicans had declared this Dirty Air Week in the legislature. And so I guess I have to ask, even though I know the answer in advance, you would not submit that being opposed to some of your regulations means that you're against clean air, would you?
It certainly depends on the regulation, sir.
You would not submit that the President is against clean air because he opposed your proposed ozone rule, would you?
No, sir.
I wouldn't think so. Or clean water?
No.
Wouldn't that be correct? All right. And so when people make blanket statements that because they oppose an EPA, some of us oppose an EPA regulation, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily in favor of dirty air, does it?
It depends on the regulations, sir.
All right. But clearly on ozone, we wouldn't have been in that category. And in regard also, there was a comment earlier that somebody wanted to know, you know, we call these job-killing regulations. They want to know where the jobs are. And I can submit to you some jobs from the 9th District of Virginia that have been lost by virtue of some proposed regulations if they go into full effect. But isn't it true that your own analysis shows that the Boiler MAC and Cement MAC proposals will in fact cost jobs? Isn't that not correct? They create some clean energy jobs, but they also have a certain...
That's not entirely correct, sir. The jobs analysis for the, you
either
mentioned
people are
Boiler
going to
MAC?
lose jobs or they aren't. Do they lose jobs or not?
Well, sir, we do an analysis. There's a range, and it ranges from a gain of 6,500 jobs to a loss of 3,100. It is not a perfect science to look at this. The jobs analysis that we do, we try to be as precise as we
But
can.
you are aware that in regard to some of your rules that various power plants across the country have already announced shutdowns of power plants and a net loss of jobs. You are aware of that, are you not?
Many of those plants are making business decisions.
Are you aware that they are laying off people?
I am aware of the fact that plants need to make business decisions so that they can stop polluting the air.
Can I then assume that you are not? Yeah, I mean, I'm just asking a simple question. Either you
I'm
are
aware
that
of the
they've laid off-
announcements.
you're
I'm aware of
the
their announcements.
Thank
I don't
you.
necessarily believe
That's-
their announcements are always fair or accurate.
Okay, but you are aware that they've announced layoffs, and the communities are concerned about the layoffs of high-paying jobs in those, in my district, rural areas where the high-paying jobs are not common. You would agree with that?
I'm aware of their announcements, and I know that some of what's in their announcements isn't accurate or fair, and some
Do you
certainly
think
is.
that the Department of Energy is accurate and fair when it says that only 1% of the mercury if in the world's atmosphere is coming from coal-fired power plants in the United States of America? Are you aware of that?
I heard you say it. I would like to see their website before I agree to it.
How do we do this, Mr. Chairman? Do I just hand her the article? All right, there you go. But do you all have data that indicates similarly that since 1995, without these regulations going into effect, the amounts of mercury in the air in the United States has actually diminished?
It's a good
and there's
point,
some other
sir,
regulations.
It's a good point. Almost half of the power plants in this country currently comply with the regulations that we are scheduled to adopt in November. So it can be done. It can be done cost effectively. It's actually a matter of fairness. Some plants are emitting mercury, and others have already addressed that pollution.
Okay. And in fairness, some of that deals with municipal waste incinerators, and that is, because I've never been one of those who says that the EPA doesn't have a purpose or does some good, and that is part of the reason that mercury has dropped in this country. But we are already at fairly low levels, and the balance that we have to make as policymakers, as your president made on the ozone rule, is between deciding whether the gain is worth the cost, and when the cost is people not having jobs and being in poverty, as we've seen that rise in this country, you can understand why many of us are concerned about the rise in poverty. You can agree that is a negative, would you not?
In your considerations, I'd ask you to look at benefits that are between $59 and $140 billion for a rule that costs $10 billion in the year 2016. That's what the benefits of the mercury and air toxics rules are estimated to be.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Jackson.
See you.
For
What'd you
coming.
do to your leg?
I tore my ACL playing
Kicked the
basketball
TV when the Saints
last
lost
week.
to the Packers, did you?
The Packers game was a little rough, but we had redemption against the Bears, and we're going to do well this weekend too. But,
that's right.
I'm glad we can agree on that. We we definitely do. I wanted to ask you. You know, we've been talking about clean air, clean water, and all of us. I think it's been laid out very clearly. All of us support clean air and clean water. I think what we're trying to get out here is where is that balance, and has there been a crossing of that balance as it relates to some of the rules and regulations we've seen coming out of EPA? I know as I'm equally concerned about clean air and clean water, I'm also concerned about jobs. And during the break, a lot of us went back home, got to meet with a lot of our small business owners, talking to people who are there on the front line of job creation. And there was a recurring theme I heard from every single small business owner I talked to. And you ask them, what kinds of things need to happen? What can we do to help you create jobs? And surprisingly, it seemed the recurring theme was they said the regulations and laws coming out of Washington in this administration are their biggest impediment to creating jobs. And so I think it's very important that we look at these regulations that are coming out and saying, what is the justification? And it seems that a lot of times these numbers are attached, and each rule and regulation is going to save lives, and each rule and regulation is going to stop people from being sick. And those are all lofty goals, but unfortunately, it seems like they're numbers that are being arbitrarily thrown out just to justify a radical regulation that really has nothing to do with improving health and safety. And I'll start with the ozone ruling. What were the justifications that you made when you came out with and proposed that rule? How many lives was that going to save? How many sick days was that going to prevent?
The National Ambient Air Quality Standards are based on peer-reviewed data that look at the health impacts. So it is made based on determining what constitutes a safe level.
So for that ruling, did you have numbers assessed to how many, whether it was lives saved? Did you say how many people were not going to have to go to the emergency room? Did you have numbers like that for that rule?
As I recall, sir, but we'll double check and get you that data. What we look at is trying to detect, to assess where, whether the number be 75, 70, what have you, where in that spectrum you protect human health with an adequate margin of safety.
Yeah.
So,
but I would imagine when you came out with that rule and you proposed that rule, you said this is going to do some things to protect public health, right?
It's the implementation of the standards over time. So as we heard earlier, you pick the health-based standard, and then over time you implement the standard to achieve that level.
Right. And so I'm using that as an example because for those of us that agreed with it, before the president made his decision and came out with his executive order saying we're not going to go forward with that, there would have been people on the other side who said, oh, y'all just don't care about public health. Look at all those lives we would have saved, and y'all are trying to block that rule from coming out. And then all of a sudden the president even says, you went too far. That rule, that regulation would not have done those things. I've got to imagine, I'm not going to speak for the president and you're not either, but I've got to imagine that the president had to disagree with your assessment that that would have saved lives or improved health because he wouldn't have rejected that rule if he thought rejecting that rule would make people more sick. And so I would just hope as the tone goes forward that as we're looking at these rules and regulations that we know are killing jobs, our job creators out there across the country are telling us how many jobs in each of their businesses these rules are killing. You want to talk about health and safety. These are people that don't have jobs, they don't have health insurance, they don't have a lot of things because they don't have that job. And then you look at the assessments that are made by EPA, and even the president acknowledged clearly that the things that you're saying weren't accurate, at least to his belief, to our belief, because he rescinded the rule. He wouldn't have rescinded the rule if he thought that was going to do something to improve health. So I hope as we're looking at these rules, we can at least have an understanding that all of these things should be put on the table. And just because somebody comes out and says, we're going to save 20,000 hospital visits, that doesn't mean you're going to save 20,000 hospital visits.
Well, the gentleman,
because you've said that about other things.
Well, the gentleman, just
be happy to.
I think in all fairness, though, the president is saying, wouldn't you agree that really was right now with the way the economy is, the way the jobs are, now is not the time to implement. And in all fairness, he's not saying somewhere in the future you might.
Well, and I'll reclaim my time because what the president's saying, if the president really thought that implementing that rule would save lives or improve people's health and stop people from going to the emergency room, I really don't think he would have gone forward with it. And he can correct me, you can correct me if you've heard differently.
I'm not going to speak for the country. I will simply say that not every deregulatory push works out well for the country or the environment. In 2009, a company called another federal agency's rules an unnecessary burden. That agency wasn't EPA, it was the Minerals Management Service, and that company was Transocean, and we know what happened the
We
next
saw that
year.
they cut corners. That had nothing to do,
they
cut corners. They actually did
They were
things they shouldn't have
protesting
been
regulation of their work.
Yeah,
and
there are companies out there that we all know
have
played by all of the rules, have played by all of the rules, and they're being shut down today. even though they didn't do anything wrong.
Their
We lost
interests
over
don't always align
20,000
with
jobs.
those of the American public.
And
though.
so while you may want to carry out your agenda, even the president's acknowledged that you've gone too far. And we've got to be concerned about jobs. I just want to put this into the record and ask a final question as my time's running out, specifically to talk about the spill prevention, containment, and countermeasure rule that has been extended to farms, and then your agency, it was going to be a 5-year implementation. Your agency rolled that back or expedited it and said in 2 years they've got to comply, meaning November of this year. Our small farmers out there are going to have to put containment. They don't even know how much it's going to cost them, containment measures. Our Commissioner of Agriculture has asked your agency over a month ago if you would review, they wrote, the commissioner sent you a letter, if you would review either rescinding the rule or giving them an extension. They haven't heard back. I would hope you would look at that, and I'll be happy to get you a copy of the letter, but look at the rule in general, what this is going to do, what kind of impact that regulation is going to do to our local farmers who are not going to be able to comply.
And the reason that I think we're looking at it very hard is because with the flooding in the Midwest and in other parts of the country, a lot of folks have not had time to comply with it. But it is an oil spill prevention rule as well. So
right, and a lot of, but states do their own containment, and I hope you'd look at that letter. And I'm sure others are out there too, and look at extending that or just rescinding it altogether. I appreciate it.
We'll put
back
your
and balance my time.
document in. I think the minority would like to look at your document first before we ask unanimous consent to do so.
Serving the right.
Okay. Madam Administrator, we're going to go around the second round. You've been kind enough to be here. Oh, Ms. Gardner. Okay. The gentleman from Colorado, I thought you had spoken. I'm sorry. Is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Jackson, for your time today. I have been told that EPA's Office of Compliance and Enforcement Assurance is verbally asking active hard rock mines to voluntarily grant blanket access to EPA personnel to conduct site investigations under CERCLA. They have been described, representatives of EPA have described the proposed inspections as part of an ongoing national enforcement initiative focused on hard rock mining. Are these inspections related to EPA's stated intention under CERCLA 108B to promulgate a rule imposing additional financial assurance requirements on hard rock mines?
Not by your description, sir. It sounds more like this is as a result of the National Enforcement Initiative to reduce pollution from mineral processing, but I can double check that for you.
So they're not a part of the financial assurance?
Not to my knowledge, but I can certainly confirm that for you.
And then could you clear up confusion about the reason for these inspections? Are they part of the National Enforcement Initiative, or are they to support EPA's CERCLA 108B rulemaking?
I believe they are the former, sir, but I will confirm.
Is there any
that.
link between the two?
Not to my knowledge, sir, but I'm happy to check on that for you.
And I'd appreciate that if you get back. How do these inspections relate to EPA's CERCLA Section 108B rulemaking?
I don't believe they're related, but I will double check that for you.
And would you provide, for the record, copies of policies, guidance, or other documents or records relating to development by EPA of any program or initiative to identify hard rock mining or mineral processing sites that may be inspected or visited by EPA representatives and or any contractors of the EPA under CERCLA Section 104B, or as part of development of a rule pursuant to CERCLA that would impose financial assurance requirements on facilities in the hard rock mining industry?
Certainly, sir.
Thank you. And do you happen to have any of that material with you today?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, and I know committee had called the office and had warned that this question was coming. And will any of the data or information gathered during these inspections be used in the rulemaking process under CERCLA Section 108B?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Will any of the data information that's gathered during these inspections be used in the rulemaking process under CERCLA Section 108B?
I don't believe so, but that's the same question. I will double check.
Okay, and then how much money right now has been budgeted for this National Hard Rock Mining Enforcement Initiative for fiscal year 2012?
Let's see if I have it in any of the background I have. I don't know that I have a line item for that. If it's possible to get it, we're happy to get it for you. It's budgeted under our Office of Enforcement.
Thank you. If you get that, that would be great. And do you have any idea what's budgeted for CERCLA 108B rulemaking?
We'll get you that as well.
Thank you. And what I've been told as well is that these companies obviously may be facing some cost of these inspections, and the companies inspected will spend considerable time working with EPA, their contractors and others, showing them on site resources necessary to gather the information, reports, meetings, EPA personnel, et cetera. And will these inspected companies be expected to bear any of the cost of the direct cost for EPA personnel and EPA contractors to visit the sites or inspected under this initiative?
Enforcement cases are generally brought for violations of the law, and when they are, the penalties are generally assessed as penalties, but not necessarily unless there are court costs as reimbursements.
And so these just seem to be inspections. Are you aware of this initiative at all? Where
certainly, generally, every year the EPA acknowledges what its federal priorities are for reducing pollution and for enforcement, and this is one of our priorities.
So is this just an inspection or an enforcement action?
Well, you do an inspection, and if nothing's wrong, there's no need for enforcement.
So is this a plan then to go into a number of these mines in different regions just to go in and inspect?
Certainly, part of our authority allows us to go in and determine compliance with federal laws.
Okay. Is this part of CERCLA? This initiative, is it part of your CERCLA efforts?
I believe they would look for violations of all environmental laws, including potentially violations of the CERCLA law, but it would not be limited necessarily to that. It could be the Clean Water Act, it could be the Clean Air Act.
So are these, do you have a listing of the mines that you intend to inspect?
I don't know if such a list exists, but if it is, it may well be enforcement confidential, since telling someone you're coming is a good way of assuring that you may not get a true picture of what they're really doing.
And then just a couple questions on energy prices. Do your regulations have an impact on electricity price?
Yes, sir.
What is an acceptable price increase for electricity?
Well, what we generally do is look at a price increase to determine impacts on the economy and also on reliability issues. And so what we know, I can't answer your question, but what we know is that the rules that have been discussed this morning, both final and proposed, have very low impacts on electricity prices.
But would a rule that increases electricity prices 5%, would that be acceptable?
Sir, it would depend on the rule. That we look at costs and benefits, and we also look at how those costs and benefits roll out over time. And
so it might be acceptable. 5% increase might be acceptable.
It could potentially be.
What about 10%? Could a 10% price increase be acceptable?
Sir, it's a hypothetical that I simply cannot answer.
Who bears the burden most in our society on increased electricity prices?
Who bears the burden?
Yeah, who do you think it hurts the most?
The ratepayers pay for electricity.
Does it hurt poor? Does it hurt poor more than a disproportionate share of our population?
Of course, for people for whom energy is a large section of what they spend, then
the answer is yes. Increased electricity prices impact poor more.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Other parts of the population.
You're welcome to answer that.
Oh. Yes, it can. If it's a greater portion of their disposable income is used for energy, then they can be hurt more, certainly.
We are now finished the first round. We're going to have another round. As you can see, there's less members, so it'll go quicker. And I'll start with my questions. A small business person came up to me and talked to me about the EPA rule called the MUD rule. I'm not sure you or anybody else knows about it. In the event of construction of a site, there's stormwater that is storm water that washes off or may wash off. EPA has stipulated exactly how construction of the site, including the layout of the mud, has to be. And of course, this increases the cost of construction and creates liability, particularly in light of the fact that EPA says if you don't comply, it's $37,500 every day for every infraction. Don't you think those kind of penalties are what deterring business operations, and it's important with a struggling economy that you don't put that fear that you could have almost $40,000 a day fee for how you structure mud after when you're dealing construction for a stormwater washout that may or may not occur?
So the majority of water pollution in this country is caused by stormwater runoff, and so the nation's Clean Water Act asked EPA to develop national standards. It's important to note a couple of things.
Do you know about the mud rule?
Well, I know that states implement
if you don't,
stormwater
I would be
rules.
surprised if you do know about it. Do you know about it?
Of course I know about stormwater regulations.
No, but the mud rule. Have you ever heard of it?
He may call it the mud rule, but
you think it's a stormwater rule? Yeah, okay.
Well, sure, because when you mix water with dirt, some people might call that mud, I guess.
Okay. But in light of the fact you just said yourself here that we've had 40 years of impact of the Clean Air Bill, and it's worked pretty good, and yet you seem to be pretty strong on increasing more regulation even with your own admission that the Clean Air Act has been working for over 40 years. So, I mean, it's just, but I'm trying to give you an example, a specific example where this Stormwater Act is really creating problems and scaring for small people that are construction.
Well, and the 37,000 or whatever figure he cited per day, sir, I'd be happy to talk to him, but those are probably the statutory maximum penalties under the Clean Water Act, and I am not aware of any specific incidents where that's been levied, and certainly I'm happy to look into your constituents.
How many employees do you have?
We have somewhere over 17,000. I think we maybe
I think
just
it's almost
shy of
18,000. Yeah. And what is your yearly budget?
It depends on you, but,
Yeah, but
I
let's
believe our budget this year is $8.4, $8.5 billion.
Okay. And those 18,000 employees, do you do town meetings? Do you ever get around to see what those 18,000 employees, I mean, do you have a strong feeling that those 18,000 people are needed? I mean, we just had admissions that the Clean Air Act's working. It's worked over 40 years. Do you think we need to continue to have 18,000 employees at the EPA?
I think we should operate as
Do you think you should have more?
No, sir. I'm not advocating for more employees, and in fact, I'm sure, as you'll see in budget discussions, EPA has been losing employees.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree that the EPA has a responsibility to communicate with the appropriate experts when assessing the impact of its rules? I think you would agree with that.
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, is the authority on electric reliability in the federal government? Would you agree with that?
I think that's a fair statement.
Do you believe that the EPA, with respect to electric reliability, has the same level of expertise, engineering skills, and knowledge of electricity markets and systems as FERC's staff?
No, but I do think we know our rules better than FERC staff, so it requires us to work together to look at real
So you don't think
impacts on
FERC
reliability.
knows the rules better than you do?
No, I said our rules.
Your
I think they
rules,
know their rules, and I
Okay.
think we know our rules, and I think we have to work
Well,
together to
what about
ensure
with respect to
reliability.
electric reliability?
Well, that's their domain, and so
Okay, so
I
you would
think
agree.
they work very closely on that.
I think I have a slide here. I think it's slide number 5. Is that up?
Yeah, it's that.
If you look at the estimates, do you have a copy there? She does. I think we just gave you a copy. Look at the estimates from FERC assessing the cumulative impacts of the EPA power sector rules compared to EPA's analysis. Which should the public trust?
Well, sir, I'm familiar with that particular FERC study, and I know that the chairman has already testified that it is based on bad information. It looks at proposed rules that were never adopted, and it looks at worst-case scenarios that aren't accurate. So I don't think that it should look at this data as being as accurate as EPA's in this case.
Mr. Chairman, where did this chart come from? It doesn't
I don't know.
have an attribution.
Is there an attribution for the chart? I think it's FERC staff gave us this, if that would be possible. Let me just, before I finish here, just make an observation. On this side of the aisle, the Democrats keep saying the Republicans don't care about clean air, clean water because we oppose some EPA regulations. But I've given you the mud rule, for example, where the Republicans do object to that. You know, but the president himself has come out against these proposed ozone rules. And could you say under that scenario what the Democrats are saying, just because the president come out against the ozone rules, that the president against clean air? Is the president against clean water? Of course not. Of course not. So I think it's hyperboloid for the Democrats here to indicate that the Republicans don't care about clean air. But the question is that the president, and I think Republicans agree, is the continued fading in this economy, that EPA regulations are continuing to hurt this economy and costing us jobs. And there has to be a balance. And I think Republicans drink the same water, we breathe the same air as Democrats, and so does the president. We don't accuse him of the things that the Democrats are accusing us. And frankly, the president recognizes, as Republicans do, that we need to throttle some of these regulations so that we can get this economy going again. And with that, my time.
Mr. Chairman, the president supports the mercury and air toxic standards, and he supports the cross-state air pollution rules strongly.
Well, I understand, but this ozone rule that you wanted to propose, which he's asked you to stop, is an indication to me that he can't be, because of this, you can't accuse him of being against clean air or clean water, is what my point is. And the Democrats are just saying because we're against some of these regulations, including something like the mud rule, that, you know, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from Colorado.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, we're trying to figure out the genesis of these slides that you guys have been using today. We'll keep working on that.
I think there's attribution in all of them.
Well, no, there's not, but we'll figure that out
most
later.
of them,
I don't
anyway.
want to take my time to niggle about the slides. I want to ask you, Ms. Jackson, my friend from northern Colorado was asking you about do utility rates, if they go up, do they disproportionately affect the poor? And obviously that's true if they're paying a larger percent of their income. I wonder if you can talk very briefly about the effect of pollution on the health of poor people.
Well,
Does air, particularly particulate pollution, but also other types of pollution, disproportionately affect the poor, and if so, why?
Well, you mean their budgets, of course. And so for the same reason that for those who are poor, who don't have as much money to spend on health care, on either prevention or dealing with the health effects of pollution, asthma, bronchitis, of course, premature death, it has a huge toll in lives and in sickness and in missed days of work, missed days of school, missed opportunities to learn. Huge economic.
You know, also, as you know, I represent a very urban district.
Oh.
And there are large pockets of poor people in my district, and I've seen numerous studies over the year that indicate poor people are disproportionately affected by pollution because they live in areas that tend to have more factories, and in fact we have several Superfund sites in my district, neighborhoods that have been contaminated by factories, and the children have higher incidences of asthma and other kinds of illnesses because they're closer to industrial areas. Are you aware of those studies?
I am, and I agree that they show that poor people are disproportionately impacted by pollution because of where they live and because of sources of pollution in their communities.
Now, Mr. Gingrey had asked you, I've noticed a trend today of the sort of the seminal question gets asked after the time has expired, thereby limiting your response to that question. And Mr. Gingrey asked you a question about the health effects of particulate pollution, but then he didn't let you answer the question. So I want to ask you if you can tell us right now what your answer to that question is about the health effects of lowering the amount of particulates in the air.
Without a doubt, it is a fact. It has been proven by independent, peer-reviewed science that particulate pollution kills. It causes premature death, and that is not EPA scientists. Those are independent scientists. It's subject to peer review, which is the standard by which good science is judged, and it's backed up by public health officials.
Now, when your agency promulgates rules, do you make up the scientific studies to support those rules, or do you rely in promulgating rules on independent scientific analyses?
We rely on independent, peer-reviewed, often re-reviewed scientific analysis.
And in my initial set of questions, I think I asked you, you also do make a cost-benefit analysis, correct?
That's right. All of our rules go with information on costs and benefits, and we're very proud of the fact that under this administration, we also do jobs analysis.
Now, the rules that you've promulgated, do the cost-benefit analyses seem to indicate that a large number, many more jobs would be lost than the health benefits to Americans?
No, in fact, the job losses when they occur or estimated in these rules are minimal, and in some cases, for example, the Mercury rule, the proposal, there was a 31,000 short-term construction job estimate and a 9,000 net long-term utility job increases. So those are actual job increases.
Now, when you do these cost-benefit analyses, do you also account for the number of jobs that would be created in the industries that develop and manufacture the technologies to comply with the rules, or are those just additional jobs that come outside of that cost-benefit analysis?
No, when we do the jobs analysis, we look at that, but in the benefits analysis, I don't believe we look at jobs benefits. We look at public health benefits in our benefits. I'll double check that, but I believe
that would be helpful. One last question. Mr. Bilbray seemed to imply that because unemployment is high in California right now, it's because of the environmental standards that were enacted by the state of California some 20 or 30 years ago. Has the EPA seen any connection to current unemployment in California to the California environmental standards?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any economic study or any economist who is trying to link the current unemployment status in California or anywhere in this country to EPA regulatory action.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Administrator, for still being here. We appreciate that. I want to rephrase a question that I asked you in the first round. In your opinion, is it better to have a plant in compliance with existing regulations continue to operate, or to shut that plant down because it cannot comply because of the cost of a proposed regulation?
In my opinion, that is rarely a choice that needs to be made, either with time or through market-based mechanisms.
Well, answer the question, which is better? Because that's the question that hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals in the private sector are going to be deciding in the coming years if all these proposed EPA regulations go into effect.
Well, our job analysis doesn't show that, sir. I mean,
well, in my home state of Texas, just last week, one company announced the closure of 2 lignite coal mines and probably 2 coal-fired power plants in or near my congressional district just last week.
I realize that, and I realize what the company said. And I know the company is Luminant, and I would quote the headline from the Houston Chronicle, which says, "Don't blame EPA over Luminant woes." Luminant has financial issues that date back far beyond the EPA mercury health standards.
That is the $64 question, Madam Administrator. Is there any evidence of any criteria pollutant that's currently regulated by the Clean Air Act that is increasing in frequency in the United States?
Is there any, I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
Is there any evidence, monitored data evidence, of any criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act that is increasing in density? In other words, that the air is getting dirtier anywhere in the United States?
No, but there are places where there is not attainment with criteria pollutant standards in the United States. Houston being a great example, Dallas another one, sir.
And in both of those cases, if the EPA had not strengthened the ozone standard in the last several years, those would be in compliance. And in any event, they are coming into compliance. So, this Republican initiative in this Congress is not to roll back regulation. We're not lowering standards. We're not reducing standards. We're basically saying, let's take a time out until the economy can regain its footing. And that's what the President acknowledged when he pulled back on the ozone standard that you had announced. On that standard, Madam Administrator, did you support the President's decision to pull it back, or did you oppose it?
I respected the decision when he made it, and we are implementing
I know that, but before it was made, you had some input into his decision. Did you support him rolling it back, or did you oppose him rolling it back?
That's not the accurate question. I recommended something differently. He made a decision. I respect his decision.
Okay, but so you opposed his decision?
No, that's not right. I am implementing the decision the President made.
I understand that. Your job is to implement.
I made a different recommendation. That's no secret, but I am implementing.
What was your recommendation?
I recommended a level lower than the current level of 75, sir. And it was. I'm sorry. It was 70.
You recommended a different level.
That's right, sir.
Okay. Now I want to comment on something that Chairman Waxman said about the amendment, the Whitfield amendment. we have a requirement in that as regulations are proposed, they use monitored data when available. Why would you oppose using monitored data when it's available as opposed to model data, which is not based on the real world?
It's not whether I oppose it if it's available. It's saying only monitoring data. In that case, you set a standard for rulemaking. Let me just answer the question, Mr. Barton. That is impossible to meet, and so you would forego all the health benefits for the eastern third of the country. You would indeed.
There's not a power plant. There's not a
my
power
belief
plant
as
or
head
a
of the
chemical plant
EPA is
in
that
this country
you would not have a
that
cross-state
isn't monitored 24/7.
Yes, but to determine whether or not the sulfur dioxide emissions coming from plants in Texas are affecting Illinois or affecting Louisiana, we do modeling.
Well,
and that modeling is reviewed.
That's not what the amendment says. You can use a model, but you input monitored data. You input real data into the model. You don't use modeled data. That's what we're trying to get at. And in the case of this cross-state air pollution rule for Texas, it's the EPA model data, not the monitored data in the state of Texas or in Illinois or Michigan. The monitored data says they're in compliance. The EPA model data says in 2 cases they may not be.
The model data show that the transport from the plants in Texas are affecting and will cause non-compliance downwind. Air blows across the country from west to east, and the emissions in Texas, the second highest source of SO2 in the country, affect places other than Texas.
Most of the time in Texas, the prevailing winds are from the north to the south, Madam Administrator, not from the south to the north.
Hit my home area of New Orleans. I mean, yes, but it does blow.
No.
The wind blows pollution across and around the country.
My time has expired.
I thank the gentleman. Gentlelady from Illinois, Kowski, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I wanted first to correct what I think was implicit, Mr. Chairman, in what you were saying, that somehow FERC opposed the rules that are affecting power plants. And I just want to quote some of the testimony at a September 14th hearing of our Energy and Commerce Committee. The experts did set the record straight. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Chairman John Wellinghoff told the committee, quote, "We do not need to stop these rules from going forward. I think these rules are appropriate. These rules, in fact, do what needs to be done in this country." And FERC Commissioner John Norris testified, quote, "I believe that the EPA has adequately addressed reliability concerns and its statutory obligations with the rules established to date, and I have no reason to believe that it cannot continue to do so as it finalizes proposed rules." We had former DOE Assistant Secretary for Policy saying there's no reason to delay the implementation of the Clean Air Transport Rule or Utility Toxics Rule. So we had actually heard testimony that I think counter the implication that you were making. But here's what I want to ask you, Madam Administrator. You identified 35 regulations that will be subject to a near-term review process designed to streamline and update the rules administered by the EPA. Is that right?
That is right.
And I'm wondering if you might be able to highlight a few of the rules that you intend to update.
We have 16 short-term reviews that we're taking work on this calendar year, 2011. Those include equipment leak detection and repair rules to reduce the burden. That suggestion came from API, the American Petroleum Institute. Increasing regulatory certainty for farmers. That's working with USDA and states. Electronic reporting, which I believe came in from the regulated sector under a variety of statutes. Vehicle regulations, harmonizing requirements, and the list goes on. I could certainly submit.
No, and actually, I would like to make sure that part of the record does include, Mr. Chairman, list of the 35 regulations that will be subject to near-term reviews.
Does the gentlelady have a copy of those?
Can we get those?
I can certainly, can I just keep them until the hearing's over and you're
Sure.
welcome to?
You certainly send them in to us.
So I guess what the point I wanted to make is that regulatory efficiency and effectiveness is a part of your agency's processes, always has been, if I'm right, a part of your processes. Is that correct?
It has been, but we're also complying with the President's order to do a retrospective look back, and that will be done every 5 years.
So can you discuss how that retrospective makes the regulatory process more efficient?
Well, as the President said, regulations are on the books, and it makes good sense for agencies to constantly be scrubbing through them to ensure that as technology changes, as we've moved into a computer age, for example, or as a great example, cars that now have secondary vapor recovery on their gas tank, having it on the actual pump, it just becomes redundant. So there's clearly opportunities, which we found in our 20 public meetings and 2 public comment periods for places to make our rules more efficient and less burdensome.
So there was some question about whether industry has that kind of input, and you actually went out and solicited that, not just in the comment periods, but beforehand.
Yes, we had 20 different meetings around the country to solicit input. We also had a website that went up very early on. We had 2 public comment periods.
I also just wanted to point out that in your testimony, you report that agency reforms proposed or finalized prior to the President's executive order are going to save $1.5 billion over the next 5 years. So I want to congratulate you on an impressive record. And I think, and again, any implication that the EPA is looking just to maintain in place or even propose regulations that are redundant in any way not necessary to your mission, just not true. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, Administrator Jackson, let me thank you for your indulging us the second round of questions today. You may be familiar that members of the Texas delegation on a bipartisan basis of this committee met with Mr. Sunstein of Office of Management of the Budget right before the August recess concerning the cross-state air pollution rule and the seeming insensitivity to the problems that were going to exist in our state. So have you communicated with Mr. Sunstein, the Office of Management of the Budget, about these regulations and the burden that they impose?
I'm aware that the meeting happened, and I believe we had staff from the relevant program at the meeting.
And so what should members of the Texas delegation expect as a result of your discussions with Mr. Sunstein?
Well, we've also, not me personally, but my deputy met with, I believe, members of the delegation. I believe that's right, last week, but I know he also met with the TCEQ, ERCOT. We've had several meetings. I've been in 2 with Luminant itself, and we also, of course, have companies like NRG in Texas who say they can comply. So we're in discussions with a number of entities in Texas.
Will you provide us and the committee staff with the minutes and memos and emails concerning those meetings between yourself and the Office of Management of the Budget?
I didn't say I had a personal meeting. I did not have any, but if there is anything with my staff, absolutely.
The agency has. And can we have the access to that information, the committee staff here?
I believe so. As long as it exists, we can get it to you.
Let me, you testified in response to an earlier question about I think Mr. Stearns asked you.
Oh, and to be clear, you mean minutes of the meeting with the Texas delegation?
No, minutes of meetings or communications between.
Oh, between us and the White House? That I'm not sure we can provide, but we can certainly look and see. If we get a request,
we'll have to. It seems as if the White House is serious about regulatory reform. This is something where all parties should be anxious to work together, and it shouldn't be this adversarial relationship to try to get a problem solved. So people ask us to work together. I'm asking you if we can work together to get this information so we can see how to solve a problem that is going to exist in my state. We were faced with several afternoons of possible blackouts last month. I don't want us to face real blackouts next summer because of the closure of coal-fired power plants to comply with the cross-state air pollution rule. Does that seem unreasonable?
No, not at all, sir.
Very well.
But I cannot promise you documents that may exist that are White House documents. They may be privileged. We can get you information regarding meetings we've had with the delegation, ERCOT, TCQ, and the company to the extent they're not privileged because we're in negotiations with them.
I would appreciate that. Of course, the White House should be anxious because they're the ones who issued the rules for regulatory relief earlier this year. So it seems like they should be anxious to work with us. Now, you testified to an answer to Chairman Stern's question about the number of employees at EPA, and I believe the number is somewhere between 17,000 and 18,000. Can you tell us how many employees have been hired under Title 42 provisions?
I don't have the number directly with me, but we'll get it to you. I think we already have gotten it to you before, sir.
Will you provide us that information? Actually, the information was provided to a member of the National Treasury Union in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. A follow-up question to that is, can you provide us with a forward-looking statement as to how many Title 42 employees you are going to require in the future? How many do you anticipate having to hire within the next fiscal year?
Well, some of that will depend on, you know, when people decide to leave, which we can't know until they make those announcements. But from a general standpoint, Title 42, which allows us to pay certain rates to very highly qualified scientists, is very closely controlled in our agency, and it goes through a process of approval to ensure that we are just.
We, as the Oversight Committee, would like to ensure that those rules are being, that their compliance is in existence, and some of the job descriptions or job titles don't suggest that they're highly qualified scientists. They may be, forgive me, but relatively run-of-the-mill scientists. So if we're paying top dollar for biologists in this employment environment, maybe we ought to have an additional look at that. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask, I have a couple of unanimous consent requests. The first is to have the letter from the Southwest Power Pool, letter to Administrator Jackson, made part of the record.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps Mr. Burgess could provide us with copies of those letters to review, and so pending that, I'll reserve my right to object.
Very well. And also the letter to a member of the National Treasury Employee Union, Chapter 280, from the Environmental Protection Agency about the Title 42 question. I'd also like to have that made
Once again, I'll reserve
part
the right
of
to
the
object.
record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will reserve the right to submit additional questions in writing, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Jackson, aren't you concerned that the EPA rule published on March 21st, 2011 that defines secondary materials that are solid waste rather than fuels when burned is going to create a disincentive to burn alternative fuels in boilers or cement kilns?
I have had discussions with my staff about potential unintended consequences with that rule, and we are discussing it as recently as this week.
And so you would agree that it's probably not the best environmental result to suddenly throw lots of landfill material like tires and tons of biomass that could have been used at paper mills into the solid waste system or into the landfills?
Sir, we are still discussing it. I would agree that we need to be careful that there are no unintended consequences like those you may be describing. But I also want to make sure that air pollution and that air quality is protected.
Yes, ma'am. And let me stretch out a little bit, and let me ask you this: Did the Solyndra plant in California have to comply with any EPA regulations that you're aware of?
Sir, I'm happy to look, but I don't know off the top of my head.
If you would look at that and also look to see if there are any delayed implementations or modifications of any EPA regulations, I would appreciate that, if you would,
happy
please.
to get that information to you.
And along those lines, were you involved in any discussions at the White House or the DOE in regard to Solyndra prior to 2011?
None, sir.
All right. I appreciate that. And I'm just wondering if you've had an opportunity to see the Commerce Department's analysis in regard to some of the EPA rules and regulations? Because while it's not available to the public, apparently there's a Commerce Department analysis that's being circulated that it would indicate, particularly in regard to Boiler MACT, that job losses could be between 40 and 60,000. Have you seen that document?
I have seen references to unfounded studies, but I can tell you our range is 6,500 jobs created to 3,000 jobs lost.
And most of the jobs, if they're creation of jobs, are going to be jobs in retrofitting the boilers. They're not going to be new manufacturing jobs. Isn't that correct?
Well, they're boiler makers, but there could be manufacturing of the pollution control equipment, bag houses, scrubbers. I actually met yesterday with a company that's building a factory. They make bag houses, and that is one of the technologies that would be put in place. They're hiring thousands of people, I think, in North Carolina.
And did I gather from your answer earlier that you all are still working on the situation with the definition of materials that are solid wastes in regard to Boiler MACT and incinerators?
I have nothing to tell you today, but you asked whether I had concern, and we are still continuing those discussions.
Okay, and have you all acquired all the relevant data that you need to make those decisions?
If you have any, we're happy to take it, sir, especially from you. But I believe the staff have lots of data from the industry and have heard their concerns.
All right. I appreciate that and yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
All right, the gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I think we've finished. We just have some concluding remarks by the ranking member and myself. But we have a number of documents that we want to put in the record by unanimous consent. I will allow the gentlelady from Colorado to indicate which ones she's approved, and we'll put them in by unanimous consent, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to make a record, we've got the documents that Mr. Burgess had just referred to. One of them is a letter dated September 20th, 2011 from the Southwest Power Pool. The other one is a document Title 42 hiring practices at the U.S. EPA that was apparently produced as a result of a FOIA request. So we won't object to those documents. There's a letter from the Louisiana Department of Agriculture and Forestry dated August 11, 2001 that Mr. Scalise had requested, and we don't object to that. There's looks like a page from the DOE website about mercury emission control R&D. We don't object to that. Then we have what appear to be 3 portions of EPA documents. We've got a cover sheet on each one, and then we've got portions of the documents. I must say that I was tempted to object to these on the basis that they're just incomplete. They're just portions of it, but as long as it's with the caveat that we all understand that they're just select portions of these documents, I won't object to those. And then finally, we have a little packet that was given to me, and they're kind of different things, so I'm going to reference each one. The first one is a chart. It says figure 614, percentage of total PM-related mortalities avoided by baseline air quality level. This appears to be one slide.
Is it possible you could approve these without
no, sir.
giving your interpretation of each one?
No, I want to give a record as to what they are.
I mean,
because
just list
some
them,
of them
but
are
you're
subjective.
now giving your interpretation of each one.
Well, in that case, I'll just object to having it put in the record.
Well, I don't see why to object. These
because
are all sources of
I'll
graphs.
tell you why, because they're from different places, and I don't want people to give an inaccurate view of where they're from. The first document is one slide from a larger document on the EPA. The second page of that is a graph that was prepared by the majority committee staff. The third and fourth pages of this document are just charts or just quotes taken out of other documents prepared by the majority committee staff. And the final page 5 of that document is apparently a chart that was provided to the committee by FERC. So they're all from different sources. I just want to make that record, and with that caveat, I won't object to that document. And then I've got a couple of documents as well. There's the document, August 2011, by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Improving Our Regulations Final Plan for Periodic Retrospective Reviews of Existing Regulations. This contains all of the different regulations that someone had asked the administrator to provide to this committee. So I'd ask unanimous consent that that be placed in the record.
By unanimous consent, all the documents you mentioned will be placed in the record.
Then I have two final documents, Mr. Chairman. These are both the studies that I mentioned in my opening statement about the positive job effect that environmental regulations can have. And I would ask, we've showed those to your staff, and I'd ask unanimous consent that those be.
And they all have sources, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. By unanimous consent, so ordered. We have concluded our questioning. We're going to adjourn shortly. Does the gentlelady from Colorado have any concluding remarks before I finish mine?
Yes, sir, I do. I just want to reiterate our thanks to the administrator for coming today. And I'd also like to note, after having sat here for now almost 3 hours, I haven't heard any evidence that the EPA regulations that are being proposed are actually having a detrimental effect on jobs in this country. And in fact, as the studies I just entered into the record indicate, thousands of new jobs in the clean energy environment will be created, in addition to the thousands and thousands of lives that will be saved because of a better environment, and the millions of people whose other respiratory illnesses and so on will be diminished because of these. So I just want to say, it's easy to talk about regulatory reform, and nobody in this room, including Administrator Jackson, believes that we should have overly burdensome regulations. On the other hand, we need to look clearly at science when determining what those regulations should be, and we need to balance in a scientific and careful way job creation and the preservation of public health. I think that's what the EPA is trying to do. I commend them for a very difficult evaluation, and I urge them to keep it up, because we need to protect the health of Americans while at the same time preserving our economy and creating jobs.
I thank the gentlelady. I would just say in conclusion that the fact that the President opposed the EPA's proposed ozone rule would demonstrate that what the gentlelady indicated earlier, that the President also is worried about over-regulations coming from EPA, and he had to step in. And I think Republicans are glad that he shares our same opinion. I think it was clearly demonstrated by Mr. Barton from Texas that the EPA has hurt jobs in Texas. He cited a couple power plants. The EPA administrator thinks that it's not true, but the evidence is that it's killed 2 large companies over there, and he also talked about plants in his congressional district. I think the third point we pointed out is that no one is accusing anyone of trying to dirty America with whether it's water or air. We're all on the same team, but we believe that over-regulation by the EPA's 18,000 plus employees could damage the economy, and obviously the President agrees. What we worry about is the EPA might be justifying regulation by claiming benefits much, much larger than the science advisors' estimates of public health risk. And that violates the executive order and kills jobs. The President issued a edict from the White House saying that he wants to roll back regulations. EPA is making an effort. I ask them to continue to do so. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. I'll keep the record open for any additional questions.